Today, the People's Republic of China is a global superpower. But just over a century ago, China was a young, weak republic torn by internal divisions and opportunistic foreign powers. The long road from one reality to the other would not be peaceful, and millions would die in the wars that forged modern China. China was constantly at war from the late 1920s to the early 1950s, including becoming one of the largest fronts of the Second World War. The Japanese invasion, followed by the resumption of the Chinese Civil War between nationalists and communists, would have huge global ramifications. But to understand how the wars for China began, we need to go a little further back to a time of great Chinese vulnerability. China's 20th century began with war, social instability, and political upheaval. The Western powers and Japan defeated China in two wars in 1895 and 1900 and forced the emperor to accept political, economic, and territorial concessions. These defeats and internal dissatisfaction with imperial rule and traditional culture led to revolution in 1911. Revolutionaries led by Sun Yat-sen founded a republic under what they called the three principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and the livelihood of the people. But 3 months later, the Republicans handed power to militarist leaders. Soon afterwards, the government and the country became fragmented into regions controlled by warlords, leaving much of China outside of the control of the central Beiyang government. In 1917, China officially joined the Allies in the First World War to improve its international standing and get European support against Japanese imperialism. But the Versailles Peace Treaty settlement gave former German possessions in China to Japan. On May 4th, 1919, student protesters took to the streets in Beijing, a movement that soon spread to other cities and other social groups. The May 4th movement was also anti-traditionalist and caused some intellectuals to adopt Marxist thinking. In 1921, Chen Duxiu and Li Dazhao founded the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. By that time, the Republic was all but dead. The country had fully entered the warlord era, where local strongmen ruled over their own provinces, allied in ever-shifting cliques, and waged constant war against each other. Sun Yat-sen split with the nominal central government in Beijing to create his own government based around Canton. From there, he reformed the KMT, the Kuomintang or Nationalist Party, and called for a great military campaign to destroy the warlords and reunify China. He hoped for support from Western nations, but when none came, he turned to the USSR for military and political help. Soviet advisor Mikhail Baradin urged the KMT to join with the CCP to boost its appeal and resources. Sun agreed, and the two parties formed the first united front in 1924. But by March 1925, Sun Yat-sen had died of cancer, and Chiang Kai-shek replaced him as military leader of the Canton government. Chiang had studied military theory in Moscow, but was worried about the left-right split within the KMT. In March 1926, Chiang's fears of a possible communist takeover led him to partially suppress the CCP. But the KMT and CCP also continued to cooperate, and in 1926, Chiang launched the Northern Expedition against the warlords. His National Revolutionary Army, or NRA, defeated warlord after warlord, but success increased the tensions with the CCP, which set up communist labor unions in the wake of the NRA advance. CCP strongholds in Wuhan and strikes in Shanghai worried Chiang's middle class and wealthier supporters. Chiang himself was also worried. The communists have now reached the zenith of their power and arrogance. If their activities are not checked, they will bring disaster upon the Kuomintang. I am not opposed to the communists. I appreciate their support and sympathy, but I advise them not to take advantage of their influence in the party to oppress the moderate elements of the Kuomintang. If a break were to come about, the revolution would be inevitably weakened. In April 1927, Chiang's fears for party unity and perhaps his own position caused him to order violent repression of Shanghai communists by nationalist troops and loyal gangs. They killed about 5,000 communists, and the United Front was unofficially over. Communist leaders, encouraged by the Soviets, responded with attempted uprisings in August, but they fell short of expectations. Without the support of the majority of workers, the communists could not stand up to the nationalist army, and neither could the warlords. In June 1928, the NRA captured Beijing, and in December, the last warlord, young Marshal Zhang Shuiliang, cut a peace deal with Chiang. Chiang announced national unification after the Northern Expedition, but this was a mirage. The next 10 years, known as the Nanjing Decade, are usually considered a time of peace in China, but internal divisions and external threats remained. After unification, Chiang stayed in military control as Generalissimo, a semi-dictator with broad support amongst the intellectual and business elite. His government also enacted some economic, educational, military and legal reforms, but the country was still divided. Landowners mostly supported Chiang, but prevented him from enacting land reform, and warlords who'd made deals with Chiang to avoid being defeated now limited his authority in their regions. A few in the West were even independent. Imperial Japan continued to intervene in China as well, and expanded its territorial control in Shandong province during the Northern Expedition. Chiang declared that to resist the Japanese, China must first complete internal unification, and by this, he generally meant the remaining Chinese communists. After their defeat, the CCP fled to the deep countryside to lick their wounds and hash out their own divisions. One branch of the party, led by Li Lisan, felt revolution could only come from the urbanized working masses, as per Karl Marx's theories. However, another branch of the party, increasingly led by Mao Zedong, advocated for a rural revolution of China's much larger peasant class. Mao had organized the Autumn Harvest uprisings in 1927, and although they failed, he was impressed by the willingness of the peasants to rise up. For the present upsurge of the peasant movements is a colossal event. In a very short time, several 100 million peasants in China's central, southern and northern provinces will rise like a fierce wind or tempest, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, will be able to suppress it. Chinese peasants had not benefited from Chiang's reforms and were still controlled by the old landowning class. In the late 20s, they also suffered from poor harvests, roaming bandits, ruthless moneylenders, and the effects of the Great Depression. The poorest 68% of the peasants owned just 22% of the land, and deaths due to malnutrition were common. American missionary couple Georgina and Edward Perkins reported a tragic case. Another desperate case that we treated for free was that of a young man who looked like a skeleton. One would have said there was nothing but skin on his bones. His family was so poor that they'd been obliged to sell him. He was accordingly sent to a family that had no sons. When, 6 years later, a son was finally born, his new family simply threw him out. These problems were not all the fault of the landowners, but they did little to ease the pain for peasants and often did not even live on their estates. Mao saw the potential for revolution. He teamed up with former warlord Zhu De and formed a tiny Chinese Red Army. And with these forces, communist groups set up Soviets in mountainous or border regions far from Chiang's influence. Mao and Zhu set up their headquarters in the mountains of Jiangxi province. Still, the split between Li Lisan's urban and Mao's rural revolutionaries in the CCP remained. In the USSR, Stalin supported Li, as did most of the party. In summer 1930, communist forces tried to capture the cities of Changsha and Nanchang, but they failed, ending Li's bid for influence. Mao was elected chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the newly established Soviet Republic of China in Jiangxi, even though he still wasn't as powerful as head of the Red Army, Zhu Enlai. So the Kuomintang ruled in most of the country, while in the remote regions the communists held on. The communist uprisings had failed again, but they convinced Chiang that he had to eliminate the CCP threat to his rule once and for all. While Chiang's forces put down communist revolts, he also had to face rebellions by his former warlord allies. By 1930, these had escalated into the Central Plains War, which the nationalists managed to win thanks to warlord Zhang Shuiliang remaining loyal. With the warlords out of the picture, Chiang turned on the communists. In December 1930, the nationalists launched the First Encirclement Campaign, also known as the Extermination Campaign. The NRA planned to blockade the CCP Soviets and destroy them. 50,000 nationalist troops surrounded the CCP stronghold in Jiangxi, but the poorly armed Red Army put up stiff resistance. Zhu used conventional tactics to fight the NRA, but Mao preferred guerrilla tactics. Despite the fact that the NRA was well trained, it didn't do well in remote areas. When the Red Army annihilated 2 nationalist divisions, Chiang called off the campaign. The NRA tried again with a second campaign in April 1931, this time with 200,000 men. Nationalist commander He Ying-chin advanced cautiously to counter guerrilla tactics, but this just exposed his men to more attacks and the NRA retreated. In July, Chiang assumed personal command of the third campaign. 3 NRA columns would force the Red Army out of its home territory and into a conventional battle. The nationalists used all-round defensive tactics as they advanced and made much better progress. By mid-September, they took most of the Jiangxi mountains and threatened Mao's headquarters. But then, on the 18th, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria, which diverted NRA resources north and forced an end to the third campaign against the CCP. The NRA then began the fourth anti-communist campaign in summer 1932, this time with 250,000 troops. They defeated the Red Army in the initial battles, but the Red Army retreated without being destroyed. In 1933, communist guerrilla tactics began to wear down the overextended NRA, and in April, the Japanese again advanced further into China and demanded the demilitarization of Hubei province. Chiang wanted to deal with the communists first, so he agreed to the Japanese demands. But the distraction gave the communists time to prepare a counterattack and grind the fourth campaign to a halt. So Red Army tactics and Japanese intervention saved the bulk of communist forces in the early 1930s. Mao saw irregular war as the way of the future for the Red Army, and he wrote some of the foundational texts of modern guerrilla warfare. Written in 1936 and 37, Mao Zedong's Strategic Problems of China's Revolutionary War and On Guerrilla Warfare are a reflection on the communist fighting practice and strategy in the 1930s. Part strategic texts, part political manifestos, and part denunciation of his critics, Mao laid out the importance of guerrilla tactics in China's civil war. Guerrilla operations must not be considered as an independent form of warfare. They are but one step in the total war, one aspect of the revolutionary struggle. They are the inevitable result of the clash between oppressor and oppressed, when the latter reach the limits of their endurance. He insisted that this kind of war was necessary for victory. We must honestly admit the guerrilla character of the Red Army rather than repudiate guerrillaism wholesale. It is useless to feel ashamed on this score. On the contrary, this guerrilla campaign is precisely our distinguishing feature, our forte, the means for us to defeat the enemy. Mao drew heavily on classical Chinese works like the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Sun Tzu's The Art of War, in particular Sun's concepts of flexibility, deception, and so-called unity of opposites. Mao used the unity of opposites, which draws on the Chinese idea of yin and yang, to argue that the communists' apparent weakness was actually strength, and the nationalists' apparent strength was weakness. The NRA might have more men and weapons, but that meant they were slower and couldn't hide their movements, while the Red Army was swift and stealthy. Mao paraphrased the ideas of Western thinkers like Prussian theorist Karl von Clausewitz, and his concept that war is politics by other means. The future Chinese leader also urged a Prussian-style concentration of force at one single point. To wound all the 10 fingers of a man is not so effective as to chop one of them off. To rout 10 of the enemy's divisions is not so effective as to annihilate one of them. Mao also added an emphasis on discipline, training, and intelligence to make sure that the Red Army maintained good relations with the population and could draw on their resources. It is only undisciplined troops who make the people their enemies and who, like the fish out of its native element, cannot live. This concept worked well with locally raised units, but locals were often still suspicious of Red Army troops from other regions. So Mao was developing his political and military thinking after the communists escaped from defeat at the hands of Chiang's nationalists. Soon enough, Mao and his comrades would be put to their sternest test yet, the Long March. In his writings on warfare, Mao also wrote about the value of a strategic retreat to live to fight another day. We all know that when two strong men fight, the wise one usually yields a step, while his stupid opponent, charging furiously, puts forth all his might and skill at the first onset, with the result that he is often floored by the man who yields. By the end of 1933, Chiang had signed a treaty with the Japanese and was planning a fifth campaign against the Jiangxi Soviet. He also got some advice from abroad and welcomed a military delegation from Nazi Germany led by General Hans von Seeckt. The Germans encouraged the NRA to advance steadily against the communist areas, building trenches and blockhouses and evacuating civilians as they went. The tips were German, but the overall strategy was Chiang's. There was no need to seek out the main force of the bandits. We only have to occupy strategic places where the bandits must come out and fight. When the NRA began its fifth attack on the CCP with 900,000 men, the new concept worked, and there were few targets for the Red Army to ambush. The USSR's advisor to the CCP, Otto Braun, urged the Red Army to attack with all its might, which led to a decisive communist defeat in April 1934. Mao and Zhu De now called for a strategic retreat to the southwest, where nationalist forces were weakest. Once out of the pocket, the spread-out communist forces could then link back up. Some communist leaders opposed this idea, but it was approved, and on September 30th, 1934, 90,000 soldiers of the First Front Army and 20,000 civilians left the Jiangxi Soviet on foot. They ended up on an epic 13-month march across the entire country. The first 10 weeks saw constant fighting against pursuing NRA troops, which cost the communists 2/3 of their forces. The Red Army ditched most of its supplies and broke free of the NRA, but couldn't link up with the Second Front Army as planned. In the ensuing debate, Mao got his way and the group headed through Yunnan to reach Sichuan and the Fourth Front Army. As the Red Army captured towns in its path, communist leaders debated their predicament. Members criticized Braun and praised Mao's strategic ideas, and they elected Mao first of a three-man leadership team, making him the de facto leader of the CCP. When the First Front Army joined up with the Fourth on July 12, 1935, Fourth Front Commander Zhang Guotao opposed Mao and demanded that the Red Army stay in Sichuan near his own power base. Mao demanded that they march to Shenxi, and the armies split up. Zhang's column soon got into trouble from cold weather, local warlords, and local Muslim tribes. Mao's group finally reached Weibo in October 1935. Of the original 90,000 troops, only 25,000 remained. Shortly after his arrival, the Second Front Army started its own march, following much of Mao's route. Since then, the Long March has gained almost a mythic reputation in Chinese communist historiography, but there is debate about the details. Officially, the CCP claims that the march covered a distance of 12,500 kilometers and featured lots of battles, like at Dadu Bridge. Other historians argue that these are exaggerations and that there were just a few skirmishes and the total distance might have only been 3,700 kilometers. The Red Army may have also blackmailed and kidnapped locals along their route to fill out their ranks, a topic avoided by the CCP. However Pyrrhic and controversial the Long March was, it did mean that the CCP lived to fight another day. Now, Mao had the chance to do some thinking about the future of the party. One of Mao's central principles was his 3 stages of insurgency warfare. In the first stage, the communist priority would be to avoid destruction at the hands of the stronger government army and gain the support of the masses. The second stage would be more violent. With new and ideologically motivated reinforcements, the Red Army could conduct raids and ambushes while avoiding conventional battles. In the third phase, the guerrilla forces would have enough men, experience, and weapons to fight pitched battles to exhaust the government and the National Army, after which the communists would launch a counterattack. While holed up in Shenxi after the Long March, Mao reckoned the war was moving into stage 2. But Mao soon began to change his tune, in public at least, to focus on Japan as the primary enemy. Many Chinese were unhappy with the nationalist government's appeasement of Japan after initial resistance. Chiang signed the treaty with the Japanese since he felt that China was not ready to take on its regional rival. But when the treaty brought the end of a popular boycott on Japanese goods, criticism of Chiang increased. Mao reasoned that many Chinese were more eager to fight Japan than each other, and even prior to the Long March, the CCP had declared war on Japan. In reality, this amounted more to propaganda statements than actual fighting, but it was a sign. In nationalist-controlled China, some groups also wanted to end the civil war. The National Salvation Association, for example, established by Sun Yat-sen's influential widow in 1936, called for the creation of a new united front between the KMT and the CCP. So the CCP appeared ready to fight Japan, but Chiang and the KMT saw the communists as the most pressing existential threat. He ordered new attacks against the Shanxi Soviet in mid-1936, but they would not go as planned. In mid-1936, Chiang told loyal warlord Zhang Shuiliang to start an offensive against the CCP. But the young marshal was tired of the civil war and had his own axe to grind against Japan. The young marshal was the son of Zhang Zulin, a Manchurian warlord and former Japanese ally. Although Zhang Sr. fought against the KMT during the Northern Expedition, the Japanese assassinated him when he'd outlived his usefulness. Then they expelled the younger Zhang from Manchuria altogether. Many of the young marshal's men disapproved of KMT's suppression of anti-Japanese student riots, and some joined the Society of Comrades for Resistance Against Japan. The younger Zhang probably even met with CCP officials in summer 1934 to talk about resisting Japan. When the anti-CCP offensive began in 1936, Chiang complained that Zhang's troops were moving too slowly against the CCP, so Zhang invited him to Xi'an to see things for himself. On December 12th, a mutiny broke out in the nationalist camp. Zhang's men attacked the Generalissimo's tent, killing his bodyguards and eventually capturing an injured Chiang. The young marshal insisted that Chiang's arrest was designed only to awaken him to the Japanese threat. He still called Chiang Your Excellency the Generalissimo, while Chiang was being held hostage. Chiang was not impressed. "You still call me Generalissimo? If you still recognize me as your superior, you should release me. If you are a rebel, you had better shoot me dead. There's nothing more to say." The mutinous officers demanded Chiang end the fighting against the CCP and create a new united front against the Japanese. Chiang refused to discuss anything until he was freed. The exact details of the so-called Xi'an incident are still shrouded in mystery. Some suggest CCP leaders were present, others that Chiang only narrowly avoided execution by the intervention of the USSR, as Stalin believed only Chiang stood a chance of effectively resisting Japanese aggression. Mao later sent a letter to Chiang suggesting that communist mediation saved his life. Eventually, following public and international pressure, Zhang released Chiang on December 22nd without any official promises. Nationalist authorities arrested the young marshal soon afterwards and kept him under a rather luxurious house arrest. Shortly after that, though, Chiang announced a stop to operations against the CCP and the creation of a new Second United Front. Chinese Civil War came to a halt in December 1936, and the next 6 months were relatively peaceful. Although the nationalists and communists didn't like each other, the Second Front held, and Chiang continued his military and economic reforms. At first, there was also quiet on the Japanese front, but Japan interpreted the Second United Front as a breach of a 1935 treaty in which the nationalists promised no anti-Japanese activities. And the Japanese generals were also eager for action. The Manchurian-based Kwantung Army, supported by the puppet Manchu Kuo Army, was mostly independent of central control from Tokyo. Japanese generals, some intoxicated by success, consistently violated the ceasefire, confident that they could beat China if war broke out. On July 7, 1937, the situation came to a head near Beijing at the Marco Polo Bridge, which was an unofficial demarcation between Japanese and Chinese-controlled territory. A skirmish broke out when Japanese troops won a nighttime exercise, which escalated to Japanese shelling of Wangping Fortress. Chiang had decided that this time they would resist Japanese aggression. The NRA incorporated Red Army units into its ranks under Commander Jules Dare, the beginning of an uneasy alliance between the KMT and the CCP, and the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The nationalists and communists had buried the hatchet in the face of a common Japanese threat, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. In 1937, a small skirmish near Beijing escalates into a full-blown war between China and Japan. None of the soldiers know it yet, but it's the spark that sets off the Second Sino-Japanese War. And with foreign powers like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union involved in the background, the stage is also set for an even bigger struggle: World War II in Asia. It's July 7th, 1937, near the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing. Japanese troops stationed in the city have decided to carry out a night exercise. As an unwelcome foreign force in China, they need to stay sharp. This time, the Japanese don't tell the Chinese troops facing them that they'll be on the move, and the Chinese open fire. The clash at Marco Polo Bridge, known in China as the Luguoqiao Bridge, set off a powder keg that had been brewing for years. Japanese troops, along with other foreign units, had been stationed in China since the Boxer Rebellion nearly 40 years before. But Japan was not just another foreign power seeking commercial advantages. Japan had seized Manchuria in 1931, Rehe Province in 1932, and had made no secret of its desire for control over a carved-up China for decades. On July 7th, following the initial exchange of fire, a Japanese soldier was missing. He was soon found, but local commander Colonel Renya Mutaguchi decided to follow up with artillery fire on Chinese positions. The Japanese demanded that the Chinese withdraw, but they refused. The Japanese military was determined to impose its will and sent reinforcements to the area in response to what they called the North China Incident and later simply the China Incident. Chinese nationalists were divided about how to respond. Chiang Kai-shek had theoretically unified China in 1928, but his nationalist party was ideologically divided, and regional military strongmen still dominated many provinces. The problem for the Chinese was that their state and their military were weaker than the enemy. Advisor Xu Yongchang was cautious. If one can stomach it, it would be best to make the utmost effort to stomach Japan. Because if a major war breaks out, regardless of whether or not a third country intervenes, at best, both sides will lose. Chiang was also worried. Earlier, he'd focused on defeating the Chinese communists before fighting the Japanese, but he and many others now saw the struggle with Japan as an immediate and existential one. This time, unlike in 1931, if push came to shove, China would resist and seek international support. Japanese leaders also discussed what to do. Aggressive generals like General Matsui Iwane urged an all-out attack on a China that they felt was a foreign puppet that must take its rightful place under Japanese influence. The first point is to make the Chinese abandon the policy of depending on European countries and America. The second point is to make the Chinese people recognize that Japanese troops are the real friends of China and have been sacrificing themselves in the current incident to rescue 400 million Chinese. War Minister Sugiyama Hajime even told Emperor Hirohito the whole thing would be over in 1 month, and moderates like General Ishiwara were overruled. The Japanese government did send negotiators off to the capital of Nanjing, but the Japanese military arrested them before they arrived, since the army and navy were not entirely within the civilian government's control. Tokyo sent a threatening message to Chiang, saying that if they attacked, his government would be the target. The Japanese certainly had the forces to back up such threats. The army had about 950,000 men, of whom 600,000 were sent to China in 1937. They also had a far superior navy and air force, more heavy weapons like tanks and artillery, and were better trained. Chinese forces, on the other hand, were a patchwork. They had about 1.8 million troops in all, but only about 300,000 of these were fully trained and directly loyal to Chiang. The rest were warlord armies and regional militias of variable quality and loyalty. There were about 50,000 communist troops under Mao Zedong who had agreed to fight alongside the nationalists after years of civil war. These forces were equipped with a vast array of different makes and models of weapons, the best of which were supplied by Germany and the USSR. The Germans wanted to access Chinese resources and to get both China and Japan in the Anti-Comintern Pact, but Chiang was careful to keep good relations with both Berlin and Moscow. The Soviets wanted to support China against Japan to prevent Japan and Germany from threatening them at the same time. The USSR would supply 450 pilots and ground crew and equip 20 Chinese divisions in 1937 alone. Analysts estimated that, on average, a Japanese division had 3 to 12 times the combat power of a Chinese one. On July 27th, the Japanese launched a full-fledged offensive in northern China, but given the vast territory and limited troop numbers, they had to follow the railway lines. They advanced quickly towards Zhengzhou, Nanjing, and through Chahar province, quickly sweeping aside weak resistance by poorly organized Chinese communists or warlord armies. Beijing fell on July 28th. Better quality Chinese nationalist troops resisted where they could, and they managed to avoid destruction. At Pingxingguan, nationalist troops held off the Japanese, while communist units under Lin Biao attacked the Japanese rear. And this modest victory was the only significant action for the Chinese Red Army until 1940. Japanese General Hisaichi Terauchi ignored the line on which Tokyo had ordered him to stop and pushed ahead as far as he could. Between September and December, Japanese forces managed to capture the capitals of the provinces of Jili, Hebei, Shanxi, Zhejiang, and Shandong. While the Japanese were on the march in the north, Chiang made a fateful decision to open up a new front around China's most important economic and international city, Shanghai. Widening the theater of operations to Shanghai and the Yangtze River Delta had several advantages for the Chinese. It would draw Japanese troops away from the north, protecting valuable resources and the supply line for Soviet weapons. It would also move the fighting to an urban battlefield more suited to defense and draw the Japanese into a drawn-out conflict that they couldn't sustain. It would also bring the war closer to the international scene, since Western powers also had garrisons there which, in Chiang's view, increased the chances of an eventual intervention by the West. Chiang's wife, Song Mei-ling, pleaded for help in a radio address to the United States. If the whole Occidental world is indifferent to this and abandons its treaties, we in China, who have labored for years under the stigma of cowards, will do our best. Chiang sent some of his best German-trained troops to the city. The Japanese had also been preparing to fight around Shanghai. They already had a garrison in the town and warships in the area as well. When skirmishing broke out on August 13th, Japanese naval guns bombarded Chinese positions. By this time, both sides had reinforced, and tens of thousands of refugees poured into the perceived safety of the international quarters. The Chinese responded by trying to bomb the Japanese cruiser Izuma, but accidentally dropped their payloads in the international settlement, killing more than 1,000 foreign and local residents in what became known as Black Saturday. A reporter witnessed the carnage. Flames from a blazing car played over distorted bodies. In shapeless heaps where they'd been huddling in shelter, bodies in coolie cloth turning scarlet lay piled up in the entrances to the main doorways and arcades of the Palace and Cathay hotels. Hands, legs, arms lay far from smashed masses of flesh. Dead in his tracks, as he'd been directing the corner traffic, lay the corpse of a Chinese policeman with shrapnel through his head. The Chinese attacked the Japanese garrison on August 17th, but failed to defeat it. And when fresh Japanese forces arrived, they began to drive the Chinese back in fierce house-to-house fighting. As the battle raged, the war escalated. Japanese aircraft bombed Chinese cities, killing thousands of civilians in a terror campaign, and Japanese ships blockaded Chinese ports. Emperor Hirohito asked his advisors how the situation could be de-escalated, but the military recommended a solution by force, and moderate politicians were sidelined. The Chinese mobilized, and the government issued a general war directive for the National Army, a move many historians have seen as a point of no return for full-scale war. In Shanghai, the grinding urban battle dragged on through September, October, and into November. The Japanese used every means of destruction at their disposal, including poison gas, and even made an amphibious landing south of the city at Hangzhou Bay to control its approaches. The Chinese desperately defended lines based on small rivers and creeks running through the city, but their counterattacks usually failed. The Japanese felt pressure to take the city in case of international diplomatic intervention, and they launched frontal infantry assaults against dug-in Chinese positions. These were costly but ultimately effective, and the last southern districts fell in November. Many Japanese were surprised at the fierce Chinese resistance. We viewed China as a dog, now emerges as a wolf. Chiang later admitted that he'd made mistakes at Hangzhou and not retreating earlier from Shanghai. In all, about 750,000 Chinese and 250,000 Japanese troops were involved in the fighting, making Shanghai, by some measures, the largest battle of the Second World War before Stalingrad. The Chinese suffered between 187,000 and 250,000 killed and wounded, including 70% of their best trained officers, while the Japanese lost between 40,000 and 100,000 of their best troops. The battle brought some diplomatic results, as China and the USSR signed a non-aggression pact in August that paved the way for more military aid. It also helped galvanize the long divided country. Many warlords rallied behind Chiang, and public opinion turned ever more against the Japanese, expressed in popular slogans like "China cannot be lost," and in songs like the March of the Volunteers, which later became and remains China's national anthem. The war soon became known in China as the War of Resistance. The Japanese had conquered Shanghai, but the war was developing into a slog in accordance with Chinese strategy. Still, some nationalists like Zhu Forhai feared collapse. This day was the beginning of my new life. I am extremely pessimistic. China will have no more history. Why should I keep my diary anymore? Defeated Chinese forces streamed west, and Chiang sacked several generals that he felt lacked fighting spirit. After success in the north and a hard-fought victory in Shanghai, Japanese commanders discussed whether they should rest their exhausted troops or push on towards Nanjing. Their decision led to one of the worst atrocities of the war. The Japanese hawks prevailed, and the High Command combined the 10th and the Shanghai armies to form the Central China Field Army under the overall command of Matsui Iwane. His forces would drive on the former nationalist capital of Nanjing to surround and crush the remaining core of Chiang's army and win a decisive victory that they hoped would end the war. In November, Chiang had moved his military headquarters to Wuhan and made Chongqing into the new Chinese capital, beyond the reach of the Japanese. But Nanjing was still an important communications hub and a powerful symbol. During the previous 10 years, called the Nanjing Decade in China, his party had started to turn the city into a symbol of what China's future might hold. A modern city with stately architecture, impressive government buildings, wide streets, and pleasant parks, all in the shadow of the mausoleum of Nationalist Party founder Sun Yat-sen. Chiang's German military advisor Alexander von Falkenhausen and Foreign Minister Shi Jie-wang told him not to fight in Nanjing. His forces were weak and disorganized after the defeat at Shanghai, and the city was surrounded on 3 sides by the Yangtze River, making it a potential trap for defending forces. But Chiang was under political pressure from influential party members and warlord allies who wanted to fight. He had to show them and the Japanese that China still had the will to resist. He also wanted to send a signal to foreign powers, since he was trying to convince the Western powers and the Soviets to intervene on China's behalf. German ambassador to Japan, Oskar Trautmann, even got involved to help start peace talks, but the Japanese did not want to compromise. In the end, Stalin said he'd only intervene if the Western powers did, but they didn't. Chiang knew this, but still urged his men on. We must defend Nanjing. In 1 month, the international situation may change dramatically. China may avoid disaster. General Matsui initially planned to bypass the city, but intelligence reports lead him to believe that Chinese forces in Nanjing are so weak it can easily be taken. So 200,000 Japanese troops attacked on December 5th. Defending Nanjing were about 75,000 Chinese troops under General Sheng Zitang, but only about 20,000 of these were well trained. Some of the rest are so badly equipped that they lack footwear, and some regional troops simply fled. The German-trained troops in Nanjing also used German Panzer Is and German-made armored cars. The Panzers had already arrived damaged in China, and they weren't suitable for Chinese terrain or climate. Still, in the urban combat of Nanjing, they engaged Japanese troops, but were later abandoned. In the hard fighting that followed, the Japanese steadily advanced. The outer ring of Chinese defenses fell on December 8th, the same day that Chiang finally left the city. The Japanese take the inner defensive ring on the 10th. As the Chinese retreated, they torched whatever they could as part of their scorched earth policy, and the advancing Japanese looted and plundered what was left. Matsui offered surrender terms, but the Chinese refused. Japanese units stormed the city walls and entered Nanjing proper on December 12th. General Tang ordered an unauthorized retreat and fled the next day. The city descended into chaos. Some Chinese units disintegrated and rushed across the river, mixing with desperate civilian refugees. Many were crushed to death at the crossing. Thousands of civilians sought the safety of the safe zone set up in the international quarter by Western residents. One of them was a German and Nazi party member, John Rabe, who hopes for support from home in vain. The Führer won't leave me in the lurch. The US military is also in the process of evacuating US citizens and soldiers from the city. Aboard the US gunboat USS Panay are over 70 people as they make their way up the Yangtze River. Next to the Panay are also 3 Standard Oil tankers evacuating their employees from Nanjing. On the 12th, Japanese aircraft bomb and machine gun the 4 ships and their lifeboats. 2 American Navy men and 2 Western civilians, as well as several Chinese refugees, died during the attack. The Panay reportedly was clearly marked as a US Navy ship. War between the US and Japan was avoided after a formal apology by the Japanese government and a payment of an indemnity of over $2 million. The victorious Japanese set to looting and burning, killing and raping in what became known as the Massacre of Nanjing or the Rape of Nanjing. Many Chinese soldiers got rid of their uniforms, as had been the practice during the warlord conflicts, and so the Japanese considered any male a potential enemy. Japanese units organized mass killings, many witnessed by foreign journalists and international residents. A Japanese soldier wrote about it in his diary. I figured that I'd never get another chance like this, so I stabbed 30 of the damned. Climbing atop the mountain of corpses, I felt like a real devil slayer, stabbing again and again with all my might. The groaned. There were old folks as well as kids, but we killed them lock, stock, and barrel. I also borrowed a buddy's sword and tried to decapitate some. I've never experienced anything so unusual. Japanese troops also raped the civilian population at will, mostly women, but also teenaged boys. The headmistress of a girls' college in the safe zone estimated that the Japanese raped about 1,000 women a night. Resident Cheng Rifang summed up the atrocities. More women fled to the college because Japanese soldiers were arriving in broad daylight to steal their money and to rape. In the streets, a lot of people have been bayoneted to death, even in the safety zone. Even more have been killed outside the zone. Nobody dares go outside. Estimates of the scale of Japanese crimes vary from 5,000 to 20,000 rapes and from 100,000 to 300,000 murders. So why did the Japanese behave this way? There are multiple factors. The army had formally abandoned the normal rules of war in July 1937, Japanese soldiers were brutalized by the violent and abusive training in their army, and they were angry about the surprising resistance of the enemy. And Japanese ideology held that they were superior to the Chinese, who had no right to exist as a sovereign nation. Japanese Army Staff Officer Ryukichi Tanaka made his position clear to a Japanese journalist. To be perfectly frank, the ways you and I look at the Chinese are fundamentally different. You seem to think of them as human, but I see them as pigs. By the end of 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War had caused massive destruction in China, and although the participants didn't know it, it heralded the start of the Second World War in Asia. Hundreds of thousands were dead, between 80 and 100 million Chinese were refugees, and Japan now controlled much of the north and east. No foreign powers had directly intervened, although Britain and the US were edging closer to supporting the Chinese, and the Soviet Union now took over from Nazi Germany as the primary supplier of Chinese heavy weapons, since Germany prioritized its relationship with Japan. The outlines of World War II in Asia were coming together. As historian Rana Mitter has emphasized, China was the first Allied power to fight the Axis. But so far at least, Japan had bitten off more than it could chew. Its Its armies had won many battles, but the Chinese refused to surrender and were determined to resist as a nation. There weren't enough Japanese troops to fully garrison the lands that they'd seized, and they had little control outside of the cities and railway lines. The conquered regions were devastated and added little to Tokyo's coffers, and Japan was spending nearly 90% of its budget on the war. That's why in January 1938, a group of Japanese commanders met in Tokyo, and their choice was an even greater escalation of the war in China and beyond. In 1938, the Japanese invasion is going disastrously for China. Major cities like Shanghai and Nanjing have fallen, and the Japanese war machine appears invincible in the field. Yet despite losing all the battles, China holds on and may even be gaining the upper hand. To this day, there's a debate whether this is just luck or a masterful strategy. So how do you win a war by losing all the battles? In late 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War entered a crucial stage. Following the Japanese invasion in July, Japanese forces occupied the key cities of Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing and pushed deeper into Chinese territory. The campaign, known as the China Incident in Japan, had transformed into a wider war than the Japanese had planned. At a January 1938 conference, the Japanese government stopped further offensives and offered peace terms, including reparations for Japan and the separation of northern China from the rest of the republic. But even before Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek officially refused, Japan severed all diplomatic contact with China. To observers, this was equivalent to a declaration of war, and Japanese troops continued to advance. Meanwhile, Chiang moved his capital to the major commercial center of Wuhan and called for continued resistance. The Japanese also wanted Wuhan, but to attack the city from the north and east, they first needed to combine the Japanese armies and secure the railway hub at Suzhou, 500 kilometers away from Wuhan. From here, they could use the Beijing-Hankou Railway to support a northern attack on Wuhan. The Japanese hoped that if they captured the major industrial center, it might end a war that was becoming expensive both in terms of manpower and materiel. Defending the area were around 300 Chinese nationalist units under General Li Zongren. He was a rival of Chiang's, but also a bold and effective commander. His formation, the 5th War Zone, was partially equipped with both Soviet artillery and tanks and trained by German officers. The 5th War Zone worked to frustrate the Japanese advance, resulting in a series of seesaw battles across the front. Eventually, the walled town of Taiyuan became the operation's focus. In bitter urban fighting, Japanese troops broke into the town in mid-March, but Chinese forces stubbornly defended the narrow streets. Chinese officer Chi Fengchen recalled, "We had to battle for the little lanes of the town. Neither side was willing to budge. Sometimes we faced each other with hand grenades, or we might even bite each other. Or when we could hear that the enemy was in the house, then we'd climb the roof and drop bombs inside, and kill them all." Eventually, the Japanese occupied about half the town, but supplies were running out, and fresh Chinese formations moved in to trap them. In early April, the Japanese withdrew, having lost around 12,000 troops, though Chinese sources claimed 24,000 Japanese dead. Chinese losses may have been just as high, but Taiyuan was the first major Chinese victory in the war. It was a huge morale boost at a critical time and reassured sympathetic nations that China could survive. But this optimism was short-lived. The Japanese reinforced their advance and surrounded the town by mid-May. Faced with superior Japanese firepower, the Chinese evacuated Taiyuan and Suzhou, leaving open a vital route towards Wuhan. The Japanese believed if they could knock out Wuhan, the war would be all but over. To reach Wuhan from the north, the Japanese needed to cross the Yellow River near Kaifeng. Chiang was worried about such a maneuver, as a rapid Japanese north-south drive on Wuhan from Shenzhou could cut off his capital from frontline units. Instead, nationalist commanders wanted to draw Japan into an east-west advance, which would allow Chinese units to retreat while maintaining a cohesive line. So Chiang resorted to dramatic measures. The Yellow River was prone to huge and deadly floods, earning it the nickname China's Sorrow. By 1938, both primitive and advanced engineering works contained and directed the river's waters to minimize flood damage. But as the Japanese approached Kaifeng, Chinese commander Cheng Qian suggested Chiang should use water instead of soldiers to block the Japanese advance. Chiang eventually gave the order to blast the dikes in central Henan, but the first attempts with explosives failed. Eventually, 2,000 soldiers, encouraged by special payments, broke the dikes by hand on June 7th. An initial trickle turned into a fierce torrent. Chiang knew civilian casualties would be catastrophic and that destroying the dikes was a political taboo. Even during the Civil War and warlord conflicts, the Yellow River's dikes had always been maintained and not used for military advantage. Nationalist army officials didn't even give locals warnings to prevent word reaching the Japanese. Within days, the Yellow River flooded up to 54,000 square kilometers, home to millions of people. Time correspondent Theodore White recalled. Last week, the Yellow River lashed out with a flood which promised to change not only its own course, but also the course of the whole Sino-Japanese War. The death toll from the Yellow River is not so much from quick drowning as from gradual disease and starvation. The river's filth settles ankle deep on the fields, mothering germs and smothering crops. Peasants await rescue or death on whatever dry ground they could find. Casualty estimates vary, but the totals were colossal. A 1948 nationalist government report suggested the flood killed 893,000 and made 3.9 million homeless. But more recent estimates suggest about 500,000 killed and 3 to 5 million homeless. Chiang falsely blamed the flood on Japanese bombing, and although much of the world's media believed him at first, within months, journalists and diplomats knew the truth. The flood did, however, stop the Japanese advance as water, mud, and chaos blocked the northern route to Wuhan. As a result, the Japanese shifted their advance along the tougher, easier to defend east-west route along the Yangtze River. The Chinese had about 800,000 men spread out around Wuhan and hoped to use natural features like the Yangtze River, lakes, and mountainous terrain, as well as fortifications, to help their defense. Troops would hold key points like the Madang Fortress and the Dabi mountain passes in anticipation of a counterattack. The Chinese plan was to keep the enemy east of Lake Poyang and prevent Japanese columns converging at Zhujiang. Once the Chinese had worn down the enemy with tenacious defense and guerrilla actions in the rear, fresh forces would outflank the Japanese vanguard and eliminate it. For such a plan to work, Chiang kept 40% of his troops in reserve. Still, despite outnumbering the Japanese 2-1, US observers noted that Chinese division's firepower was only 1/3 to 1/12 of that of a Japanese division. The Yangtze River also provided advantages to the Japanese when they launched their attack. Their navy brought in troop transports, destroyers, and even a cruiser. Japanese troops landed at Anqing on June 15th before pushing on towards Madang. The Japanese also supported their offensive with diplomatic maneuvers. Germany had hoped that both China and Japan would join the Anti-Comintern Pact opposing the Soviet Union and had sent arms and advisors to Chiang to oppose Chinese communists. However, only Japan joined the pact, and they now pressured Germany to end all support for Chiang, as German weapons were now being used against them. Hitler agrees and withdraws advisors and support by late June. Since the nationalists received 60% of their armaments from Germany, this was a significant blow. Then on June 26th, Japanese attackers forced their way into Madang with air attack, naval bombardment, and poison gas. Madang's loss opened a key point in the Chinese defense, and a month later, the Japanese captured Zhujiang against little resistance. Much like at Nanjing the year before, Japanese troops massacre and sexually abuse civilians in the city. The Yellow River flood now delayed the Japanese east-west push, but they advanced again by late August. One Japanese column moved along the Yangtze towards Wuhan, another cut across the north towards Xinyang, and another trudged through and around the Dabi Mountains. Overall, the Chinese defense was imbalanced. In some places like Ruqiang and Tianjiajian, they fought almost to the last man and only gave in after Japanese gas attack. Elsewhere, there was little coordination. At Xinyang, the city fell on October 12th without a fight when a relieving Chinese commander refused to continue its defense. By mid-October, Chinese resistance in the north, south, and east was crumbling, while Japanese bombers pounded Wuhan. With foreign intervention looking unlikely, Chiang ordered a withdrawal on October 24th, and Japanese troops entered Wuhan. Simultaneously, a Japanese amphibious force captured Guangzhou near Hong Kong, depriving Chiang of another important economic and communications hub. The fighting in and around Wuhan likely cost around 500,000 Chinese military and civilian casualties, with perhaps 250,000 soldiers killed. The Japanese claim they lost around 35,000 killed or wounded, although Chinese sources put Japanese losses as high as 200,000. Chiang expected the Japanese to follow up Wuhan's capture with more attacks. In November, he controversially ordered the torching of Changsha, an influential center of Chinese learning, to deny its use to the enemy. 800,000 fled their homes, but the Japanese had no intention of moving further west, yet. In reality, the Japanese were exhausted. They hoped capturing Wuhan would end the war, but instead, atrocities, the flood, still widely believed to be caused by Japan, and nationalist propaganda all encouraged resistance and earned international sympathy. The US State Department's John Carter Vincent reported, "The Chinese do not appreciate the strength of their own position. If they can maintain resistance in a reasonable degree of effectiveness, then Japan may withdraw from China within a year." He was wrong about the timing, but correct that avoiding defeat was a victory of sorts for Chiang. As the Japanese shifted to the defensive, Chiang built up his new capital in the provincial city of Chongqing. Government agencies, industries, and the military now converged on the city, but the government didn't just move, it also evolved. Traditionally, Chinese governments provided little support to their people, but also demanded little in return. But now, with total war brewing, the state demanded increased service in exchange for more government responsibility. The nationalists introduced social welfare provisions for refugees, war endurance measures like land reform, and mobilized women. Economically, the nationalists were in a dangerous situation, having lost 63% of their income to Japanese occupation. But good harvests meant that workers could be paid in additional rations. Some industrial equipment had already been evacuated from Wuhan as well. Chongqing, though, was not the only Chinese capital. In the north, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party established a rival capital at Yan'an. Outside of nationalist control, Mao introduced his own economic and agricultural reforms, often under strict party control. Isolated from both the nationalists and other Chinese communists, Mao reaffirmed his authority over his rivals, but his Red Army wasn't very active against the Japanese. So the Japanese stopped major operations, but they did keep up the pressure. Aerial bombardment was a component of the war from its earliest stages, but now the Japanese bombers attacked with renewed intensity. In spring 1939, Chongqing quickly became the most bombed city in the world. Japanese attacks were especially heavy on May 4th and 5th, with 5,000 Chinese troops and civilians killed. The bombing raids, carried out by the Japanese Navy, typically consisted of 18 to 36 aircraft, although this would later increase to 90 by 1940. Chinese air defenses were primitive, and there were few fighters for defense. In 1937, the Soviet Union did provide 450 planes and pilots, and claimed to have shot down 625 Japanese planes by May 1939. But these figures are probably inflated. In any case, the Chinese needed the fighters that they did have to defend more important targets like railway hubs. Instead, Chongqing relied on a basic but effective early warning system of observation points and beacons. The city's mountainous terrain provided lots of room for bomb shelters, which soon became second homes for residents. Chinese writer Han Suyin described conditions in a shelter. "We sit in the stifling damp, drenched with sweat, fanning, stirring up the foul air to no purpose. In the dim cave light, faces are white, glistening with sweat. Babies lie in stupor in their mother's arms, dead still as though anesthetized. Listless, the older children sit hunched on the benches, drugged with exhaustion." In reality, Japan had not prepared for a long war, and were struggling to develop a strategy to end it. Bombing at least allowed them to strike militarily and undermine Chiang's political position, and in Chongqing, Chiang had serious Chinese opposition. Wang Jingwei was a former student of the Chinese Republic's founder Sun Yat-sen and a devoted nationalist. However, he was also a strong rival of Chiang and likely felt that he should have succeeded Sun Yat-sen following his death in 1925. Wang soon attracted other anti-Chiang figures who, although not necessarily pro-Japanese, preferred a pan-Asian relationship to being dependent on European or US power. They also believed the continuing war would only increase China's suffering. In late 1938, the group left for Indochina and then emerged in Shanghai as leaders of the Japanese-created, reorganized national government. But these would-be leaders of a Japanese-aligned China were soon disappointed. Although Japan had relied on puppet regimes to rule Manchuria, Tokyo put little effort into such a system for the rest of China, partly because they did not anticipate occupying the whole country when the war began. Japanese leaders gave little support or even attention to Wang's government and didn't even recognize it as the official government of China. Wang's co-defector Zhou Fuhai understood why. If the new national government has no significance, then what is the point of organizing it? You want to keep a space open for negotiations with Chongqing. We don't oppose the Japanese talking to Chongqing, but if you won't recognize the new government, then we prefer not to organize one. Japan had no long-term strategy on occupying mainland China politically or economically. China's destruction as a Japanese export market also impacted the Japanese as well as the Chinese economy, as did the flight of Chinese civilians into nationalist areas. In February 1939, Catherine Hand, an American and Japanese-occupied Yizhou, observed, "The city remains a sort of military fortress, mostly in ruins, with no local business, and few inhabitants except for soldiers. Many who were doing well before the war are without jobs or the prospect of them." As they expanded further from the coast, the Japanese also found a less cooperative local population. The Japanese used both incentives and suppression to control locals, and brutality was commonplace. The occupation also provided the basis for the Japanese to further commit crimes against humanity. In Manchuria, the infamous Unit 731 conducted human experiments on Chinese and Soviet soldiers and civilians, including widespread sexual abuse and mutilation. Unit 731 members killed up to 400,000 victims with no recorded survivors in one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. And so by 1939, Japan had won on the battlefield, but hadn't conquered China and couldn't effectively govern the devastated regions it occupied. How did the Chinese army, with seemingly so many problems, manage to hang on? An approach of avoiding significant battles, or at least making space for retreats, is nothing new in strategy. In the Chinese strategic tradition, it dates to at least Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and was debated by Chinese thinkers in the decades before the Japanese invasion. While some Chinese leaders advocated for holding key positions when dealing with Japan, others called for a long-term attritional approach, even if this condemned parts of China to destruction. Hu Shi, the Chinese ambassador to the US, wrote, "We must prepare to suffer the ruin of seaports along our coast, the loss of multiple provinces occupied and destroyed. We must prepare to fight against the enemy bitterly for 3 or 4 years. We must prepare to engage in military failure for 3 years, and with the Alpha Army destroyed in the front line and the commercial centers as the battlefields." But this approach works best against an enemy with no long-term strategy or clear idea of its war goals. If Japan had been able and willing to create an effective puppet regime, as they did in Manchuria, limited their occupation to coastal regions where Japanese influence was strongest, and not committed atrocities, they might have gotten more defections, extracted more resources, and prevented international condemnation and isolation. In the end, Japan did none of these things, and instead overextended itself in a war it didn't know how to finish. But did Chiang Kai-shek deliberately pursue this approach? His political and military reputation has been hotly debated, a debate made muddier by today's political disagreements in China and Taiwan. Chiang's supporters argue that he knew Japan could not fight a long war, and so pursued a deliberate and effective long war strategy. In essence, he traded time for his most ample resource of space. They also suggest Chinese failures resulted from poor leadership of his generals and that Chiang's micromanaging approach likely prevented disaster in 1938. Chiang wrote about this after the Wuhan withdrawal. If we had fought against them with our whole army after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the Republic of China would have collapsed. However, today, when we have fought for 17 months, not only can the Chinese army continually resist the enemy until they fall into the quagmire, but also our national spirit is getting higher and higher, and our conviction of final victory is getting firmer and firmer. Meanwhile, Chiang's critics suggest he had little strategic forethought and instead bungled his way from disaster to disaster, often interfering in his generals' operations. Others suggest any Chinese success in 1938 really belonged to a handful of generals from the Baoding Military Academy, a rival institute to Chiang's Whampoa Academy. These generals were sometimes critical of Chiang and worked together to avoid his meddling. Others claim he relied heavily on German advisors and that the victory at Taiyuan was a result of German-trained commanders, not Chiang's overall leadership. Some American critics, like Frank Dorn, go so far as to suggest he had little strategic insight and was happy for others to fight and pay for his war, earning him the nickname General Cash My Check. Regardless of how much credit Chiang actually deserved, the Chinese had preserved their fighting strength. Furthermore, China's fractured and decentralized state meant that many provinces didn't consider themselves politically or culturally tied to the major cities of Shanghai, Nanjing, or Wuhan. As a result, their loss did not trigger a national collapse. This was something the Japanese only belatedly realized. They consistently thought capturing Chiang's capital would end the war, but they'd failed to understand the nuances of Chinese domestic politics. Later in 1940, Chinese professor Chang Chi-yun commented, "Japan is much better materially than we are, but the most important thing she lacked is far-sighted leadership. Since the Japanese don't really understand China, they, of course, cannot conquer China." Meanwhile, Japanese expectations of a short war meant they didn't prepare to occupy China, pacify the locals, or extract resources. As a result, commanders overlooked their men's atrocities due to an expectation of quick victory. Japanese crimes provided rich ammunition for Chiang's sophisticated message, which combined nationalist and anti-Japanese propaganda with traditional mediums like song, poetry, and theater. Not only did this increase his influence in previously distant provinces, but also provided enthusiasm for mass mobilization and a growing guerrilla campaign. Overall, Japan's military victories were enough to defeat the Chinese as the Japanese imagined them to be, but not enough to defeat China as it actually was. Tokyo had made a grave mistake. It had no coherent strategy and dramatically underestimated its opponent's capabilities and will to resist. This meant that by 1939, the days of rapid Japanese advance across China were definitively over. In 1937, the Japanese advanced on average 29 kilometers a day, and in 1939, this reduced to less than 1. Even more worryingly, new actors were entering the fray. December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the world and brought the US into the Second World War. But why did the Japanese resort to such an attack against a powerful rival? And what did it have to do with the Japanese war in China? To understand the Japanese decision to attack Pearl Harbor, we need to go back to 1939 and the ongoing Sino-Japanese War. By that time, the days of rapid Japanese advance across China were definitively over. In May 1939, Soviet and Japanese forces clashed along a disputed border at Khalkhin-Gol in Mongolia. Although starting as a small-scale ambush, it soon developed into a significant battle and the most serious flare-up of hostilities between the two regional rivals. Soviet forces, led by General Georgy Zhukov, heavily defeated the Japanese. The defeat was a blow to Japanese self-confidence and revived their fears of a Soviet attack in Japanese-controlled Manchuria. Chinese President Chiang Kai-shek hoped that the Soviets might finally intervene directly in the Sino-Japanese War. But unexpected diplomatic events surprised both Chiang and the Japanese. On August 24, 1939, the Nazi German and Soviet governments announced the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact. This deal made Japan even more afraid of a Soviet attack, while for Chiang, it suggested the Soviet Union would no longer intervene on his side, since Germany would oppose a Soviet strike against the Japanese. Chiang's worries turned out to be more realistic. The pact helped end the Khalkhin-Gol violence, and the Soviet Union shifted its focus to Poland, which they'd secretly agreed to divide with Germany and the pact. The outbreak of the war in Europe in September caused mixed reactions in Japan. Some militarists took heart at German expansion and success, but some senior civilian politicians feared being pulled into a foreign war. Within the Japanese leadership, a split began to form. This all occurred against the backdrop of spiking global tensions, and it now became more important than ever for Japan to end the quagmire in China. Japan was still gaining ground. It had captured Nanchang in May and Nanning in November 1939, but this didn't bring victory any closer. Japanese forces were still overstretched and burdened with a vast territory to occupy and repress. But for Chiang, World War II provided a political opportunity if he could position the Sino-Japanese War within a wider global conflict. Frankly speaking, our purpose in resisting Japanese aggression is to have the war ended with the war in Europe and the World War at the same time. The Sino-Japanese problem is not simply the problem between China and Japan. It is a problem of the whole of East Asia and also of the whole world. Chiang's goal was to get more international support for his nationalist forces. Ever since the Japanese invasion in 1937, the Chinese earned some international sympathy, especially from Britain and the US, and the nationalists tried to get their message out via Western journalists and academics. But more importantly, Chinese nationalists relied on international support for equipment, especially artillery and heavy weapons. After Hitler stopped German assistance to Chiang in 1938, the Soviet Union stepped up as China's primary supplier, providing enough armaments for 20 divisions, although the USSR reduced its assistance after the Nazi-Soviet pact. Instead, Britain, France, and the US stepped in to help China. The UK and France prioritized Europe, but they did send supplies to the nationalists via French Indochina and the Burma Road. US President Roosevelt facilitated a private loan of $25 million to Chiang for arms purchases in September 1939, and many private citizens also contributed. Retired US Lieutenant General Claire Lee Chennault helped form the Chinese Air Force from 1937 and created an American volunteer group of US airmen, later known as the Flying Tigers once they saw action in 1941. But supplying Chiang was tough. The Burma Road was dangerous, slow, and rife with corruption. The overall amount of supplies that was sent were also comparatively low. By 1941, the US had authorized 821,000 tons to Britain for its war effort, but only 16,000 to China. Maintaining even this level of foreign aid was a challenge for Chiang. He had to compete against pressing issues elsewhere and present an image of a unified and competent government that could defeat the Japanese. To do this, he launched a series of counteroffensives across China in winter 1939. Supported by up to 500,000 troops, the attack didn't get far and showed a chronic inability to combine arms. However, it did contain Japanese advances from Nanning and showed China was taking the initiative. Fortunately for Chiang, 1940 brought more problems. The German invasion of France further distracted international attention, and worse still, Japan was still advancing and moving to strangle the nationalist supplies. In July 1940, Prince Fumimaro Konoye became Japanese prime minister. Faced with economic troubles and even food shortages in Japan, his government wanted to exploit Chinese resources. But to do this, they needed to end the war and defeat a China being supplied from abroad. Japanese military planners had been considering this problem for a while. One supply route was the Haiphong-Yunnan Railway starting in French Indochina. In September, Japanese troops occupied northern Indochina after Vichy French authorities refused to cut the railway and grant Japanese transit rights through the colony. After initial clashes, the Vichy French authorities signed a deal agreeing to Japanese demands. In reality, the Japanese army made the move without official orders from Tokyo, but the government approved after the fact. Japanese diplomats also pressured the British into temporarily closing the Burma Road for several months. These moves may have cut Chiang's supply routes, but it also brought Japan into closer conflict with the USA. Following the Indochina occupation, President Roosevelt introduced the first ever US peacetime draft and the first economic sanctions on Japan, including export limitations on scrap metal and aviation fuel. The growing animosity between Japan and the US also pushed Japan further towards the Axis powers. In September 1940, it signed the Tripartite Pact with Italy and Germany, a defensive military alliance mostly aimed against the United States. Support in Japan for the pact was not unanimous, though, and senior Navy officers felt a German alliance only increased the risk of war with America. Meanwhile, Chiang had problems closer to home as well. The Chinese United Front officially allied Chiang's nationalists with Mao Zedong's communists, but it was under pressure. By mid-1940, Mao warned his generals not to trust Chiang. You should not have any further false hope about the nationalists. Do not rely on them to help you with anything. If you end up being attacked by the nationalists on one side and the Japanese on the other, it will be extremely dangerous for you. By August 1940, the Communist 8th Route Army had grown to around 200,000 troops. Although including support, guerrilla, and militia troops, the number may have been as high as 500,000. With these forces, the Communists launched the 100 Regiments Offensive, one of their few conventional campaigns of the war. 104 Communist regiments moved against the Japanese and collaborationist forces in northern China. Although the offensive did not retake any key cities or territory, the Communist forces inflicted an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 Japanese and collaborationist troop casualties and devastated the Japanese-held infrastructure. The Japanese responded with a major counterattack and retaliation against civilians, including with poison gas. After the offensive, Japanese General Yasuji Okamura implemented the 3 alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all. Even though the Communists had attacked the Japanese, Chiang was concerned about Mao's growing power. Tensions reached a head in January 1941 when Communist and Nationalist forces clashed along the demarcation line between their areas. There's still extensive debate, especially between Taiwanese and mainland Chinese historians, about who attacked first, but after fierce fighting, the Nationalists prevailed. Officially, the United Front held, but practically, it was all but dead. Meanwhile, in Europe, German fascism seemed unstoppable. This combination of geopolitical fears and the lure of expansion fundamentally shifted Japanese strategy. Firstly, it's important to remember the Japanese civilian government in Tokyo had only limited control over the military, especially the army in China. Military ministers wielded powerful influence and the ability to essentially veto government policy. Under Prince Konoe's war minister Hideki Tojo, the imperial army became especially powerful. Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka, although supporting the Tripartite Pact, also recognized the military dictated its signing. The army is the playwright of the pact, and I am a mere actor. Unlike the Japanese Navy, who were concerned about the US, the Japanese Army's primary concerns were China and the USSR. In April 1941, they found a diplomatic solution to at least one of their problems when Japanese leaders signed a 5-year neutrality pact with the Soviet Union. The goal was to avoid a war with the Soviets while simultaneously fighting the Chinese, but the pact also freed up large numbers of Japanese troops for operations elsewhere. And Japanese army leaders had long been discussing where they would put their troops to use. One potential area of expansion was Southeast Asia and the European and American colonies of Malaya, Sarawak, the Philippines, and Dutch East Indies. These colonies, whose masters were now distracted in Europe, were rich with natural resources, especially rubber and oil, which Japan needed for the war in China. Capturing them in a so-called Strike South would also highlight Japan's role as the masters of a new Pan-Asian empire free from white imperialism. But Navy leaders were concerned about US industrial might. In June 1940, the US announced plans to increase naval tonnage by 70% within 8 years. Congress approved a program of 257 new ships at the cost of $131 billion in today's money. Japan simply could not keep pace industrially, so Japanese naval planners highlighted December 1941 as the moment the balance of power would be most in Japan's favor. Even so, Japan would have to strike first and maintain the momentum. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku felt the situation was urgent. We must strike the US fleet a blow at the initial stage, and afterwards destroy each fleet as it sets out to keep the Americans from rising to their feet. Otherwise, Japan, with its inferior national strength, will be increasingly at a disadvantage as time goes by. However, even the Navy was divided. Many senior officers, especially those who'd studied the US Navy closely, felt war with the US would end in disaster. But most junior officers were not so worried. German success ignited their appetite for expansion, especially the invasion of the USSR in June 1941. With Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union either occupied or isolated, one Japanese leader commented, "This is a golden opportunity that comes once in 1,000 years." These junior officers, taken as a whole, could and did influence high-level decisions. Known as bakuryo, or officers behind the curtains, they pressured, intimidated, and influenced their superiors, including by not following orders. Senior leaders were sometimes reluctant to punish insubordination, especially when it was supported by the wider officer class. Meanwhile, Japanese advances in China had slowed down, so officers were eager to earn success and promotions elsewhere. In July 1941, Japanese troops completed the occupation of South Indochina. For the US, it clearly showed a Japanese intention to project influence and perhaps military might further afield. With significant anti-Japanese sentiment building at home, President Roosevelt introduced fresh sanctions, including freezing Japanese assets and an oil embargo. Since 80% of Japanese oil came from the US, this was a significant blow to Japanese domestic and military supply. Japanese ministers expected reserves to dry up within 2 years. And so, as German troops pushed towards Moscow and Europe, Japanese leaders were discussing their own offensive operations in the Pacific. Some had reservations, but military failures in China, US sanctions, and pressure from junior officers added fuel to the fire. After the announcement of US sanctions, the Japanese cabinet held an emergency session. The result was the outline of national policies in view of the changing situation. Although not officially a decision for war, it was the first time expansion south was written into an official document. Our empire will continue its efforts to effect a settlement of the China incident, and will seek to establish a solid basis for the security and preservation of the nation. This will involve taking steps to advance south. Japanese leaders had been developing concepts of southern expansion for decades, but previously these avoided provoking other nations. But from August 1941, military planners drew up invasions of neutral Thailand, British-ruled Burma, Malaya, Singapore, Sarawak, Borneo, and Hong Kong, the US-controlled Philippines, as well as the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and multiple Pacific islands. However, at another conference in September, imperial intervention shocked ministers. Emperor Hirohito broke his traditional silence by reading a poem espousing global peace and called for renewed negotiations. But negotiations were already at a deadlock. US Secretary of State Cordell Hull was adamant that any deal depended on Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina. Meanwhile, Roosevelt was unlikely to accept any deal which abandoned Chiang, especially as the Americans saw Chinese resistance as a component of a global war. A Chinese collapse could spell disaster for the Soviet Union and allow for a Japanese stab in the back, despite the Japanese-Soviet neutrality pact. Although Prince Konoe thought about a withdrawal, War Minister Tojo fiercely opposed it and encouraged a military response against the US. At a conference in mid-October, Konoe tried to persuade Tojo against war, but he insisted. "We can't bow to England and the United States. We've lost 160,000 lives so far in the China incident. If we go on talking, we'll lose our chance to fight. We're already losing valuable time for operations." As a result of the deadlock, Konoe resigned his position and Tojo took over as combined Prime Minister and War Minister. The Japanese decision for war was now all but sealed. On November 1st, after a marathon 17-hour conference, Navy Minister Shigetaro Shimada finally gave his support for a strike south. Tojo privately announced negotiations would end December 1st, followed shortly by military action. In late November, Hull issued a final offer to the Japanese: withdraw from China and Indochina in exchange for the unfreezing of Japanese assets and a favored trade deal with the US. Although it contained no deadline, Tojo considered it an insulting ultimatum. On December 1st, Tojo reiterated the need for rapid war at an imperial conference. Emperor Hirohito listened and silently left the room, signaling his lack of opposition. The US knew of imminent attack via intercepted diplomatic cables, but did not know when or where it would take place. In reality, a Japanese strike group of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and 17 other ships had already slipped into the Pacific. Their target was the US naval base at Pearl Harbor. The reasons for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor are still debated today, especially between Western, Chinese, and Japanese historians. Many Japanese still believe that US sanctions provoked Japan into attacking, but most non-Japanese historians agree that US sanctions were a reaction to the Japanese expansion that was already taking place. But why did Japan feel the need to expand south? Here again, there's a debate. Traditionally, especially after the war, historians outside Japan accused the country of seeking a wider empire simply to satisfy a desire among the elite and the masses for military expansion. These historians claim that Japan, taking inspiration from Germany, hoped to create a so-called Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which would remove American and European influence from the Pacific and leave Japan as the preeminent Asian power. Realistically, this mostly concerned China, Southeast Asia, and India, but more ambitious versions even envisioned creating puppet states in Australia, Central and South America, the Caribbean, and parts of North America, although few Japanese leaders considered this likely. Frank Dorn, a US-China expert and former advisor to Chiang, suggested Japan was on a, quote, path of naked aggrandizement that would inevitably clash with US idealism and interests in Asia. Imperial dreams did motivate some Japanese figures, especially the influential younger officer corps. But other historians argue empire building was not a priority for senior decision makers. According to this argument, a Japanese pan-Asian empire was a beneficial side effect for Japan, but not the goal of Japanese southern expansion. These historians, like Sarah Payne, argue China was always the key Japanese issue. Southern expansion wasn't just for imperial conquest, but to gain the resources that Japan needed to win the Sino-Japanese War. This became even more vital as Japanese offensives in China failed in 1941. With the war in China costing far more than originally intended, Japanese leaders needed some kind of payback. They were willing to pursue negotiation to a limited extent, but drew the line at withdrawal from China and especially Manchuria. Simultaneously, the US refused to abandon China, which they saw as a vital component in a wider global war. Furthermore, Japan was unlikely to attack the Soviet Union alongside Germany and fully honor the Tripartite Pact, while simultaneously remaining bogged down in China. Although some Japanese leaders, especially senior naval staff, rightly concluded that a war against the US would be disastrous, they were pressured and overruled by Tojo and the more powerful army officers. Unlike the Navy, the Army had little experience with the US and underestimated its abilities. Whereas the Navy based its conclusions on quantifiable data like industrial capacity, naval tonnage, and shipping, the Army placed more faith in abstract concepts like superior Japanese fighting spirit and determination. They also expected local Asian populations would rise up to support them against the Europeans and American colonial masters. On almost all points, the Army leaders would be proven wrong. Far from ending the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would firmly connect it to the Second World War. On April 18, 1942, American B-25 bombers take off from the aircraft carrier Hornet in rough seas to strike an unexpected blow at Japan, revenge for Pearl Harbor. After hitting Tokyo, the planes will land in China, which finally has powerful allies in its now 5-year-long war against Japan. But those American bombers over the Pacific mean China and its new alliance face tough times ahead. The American Doolittle bombing raid of April 1942 does relatively little damage in Japan other than some hits on the Japanese carrier Ryuho. But it's a morale boost for the US public and military after Pearl Harbor, and an embarrassment for the Japanese, especially the army, which was responsible for the defense of Japan's skies. And the army has been having a hard time for years, as it was bogged down in a 4-year-old war and occupation of China even before Pearl Harbor. Despite the brutal Japanese occupation and the creation of Japanese-controlled puppet states, the Chinese haven't broken. The nationalists and communists created a fragile united front and were now allied to Britain and the United States. The start of the Second World War in Asia meant that the Sino-Japanese War, raging since 1937, merged with the global war as part of the China-Burma-India theater. Doolittle's modest raid was a sign of the alliance China had been hoping for, but immediately it was a double-edged sword. The Americans only informed the Chinese about the raid a few days in advance, and Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek worried his army wasn't prepared if the Japanese wanted revenge against China for allowing American planes to land there. The ground war actually started well for nationalist China in 1942, as they stopped a major Japanese push towards Changsha in January. But just as Chiang had feared, in May 1942, Tokyo ordered a rushed attack on the regions of Zhejiang and Jiangxi to capture the Doolittle airfield, and to punish the Chinese. The commander-in-chief of the China Expeditionary Army will begin the operation as soon as possible. He will concentrate on the annihilation of the enemy and the destruction of key enemy air bases in the Zhejiang area in order to crush the enemy's plans to conduct aerial raids upon the homeland from this area. They even brought back some of the air power that they'd moved to the Pacific. Operation Seigo begins May 15th as 140,000 Japanese troops under General Shinroku Hata attacked 260,000 Chinese troops under General Gu Zhutong. 2 Japanese armies moved to capture the airfields at Lishui, Chuxian, and Yushan, along with the town of Qinhua and critical railways. The nationalist armies in the Third War Zone resisted and even counterattacked, but between May 28th and June 12th, Japanese troops took Qinhua, Linchuan, Chuxian, Yushan, and Nancheng. The Japanese didn't have enough troops to keep all the territory and withdrew in August, leaving garrisons to ensure they controlled local sources of copper, tin, and fluoride. The Japanese advance left a trail of destruction behind it. Anyone they suspected of helping the downed American aircrew was tortured or killed. They looted locomotives, rail cars, and medical supplies, slaughtered livestock, burnt crops, and destroyed infrastructure. By some estimates, up to 16 million refugees fled, and Japanese atrocities, hunger, and disease killed about 250,000 Chinese civilians in the offensive. Japanese atrocities and sexual crimes in Nancheng were such that witnesses drew comparisons to the infamous rape of Nanking from 1937. The Japanese burned the town before they left, just as they burned Yushan for having hosted a parade in honor of 2 American flyers whose planes had crash-landed there. As the Japanese withdrew, Biological Warfare Unit 731 prepared anthrax, cholera, and typhoid germs, which Japanese troops used to contaminate drinking water and food that they left behind. He Fuxin's family was infected with anthrax. In August 1942, when I was 23 years old, 6 out of 7 members in my family were infected by ulcerative skin lesions on the legs within a month. In the beginning, there were itching and burning blisters on our legs. Then, about 5 days later, our legs began to ulcerate, and black flesh and blood dropped off all day. The skin around the wounds was as black as charcoal. My grandparents, parents, and aunt all died of it. Only 2 in my family survived. It's not clear how many Chinese they killed, but they unintentionally killed about 1,700 fellow Japanese soldiers. Tamura Yoshio, who worked on plague experiments at the unit's location in Manchuria, recalled the mindset. I had already gotten to where I lacked pity. After all, we were already implanted with a narrow racism, in the form of a belief in the superiority of the so-called Yamato race. We disparaged all other races. If we didn't have a feeling of racial superiority, we couldn't have done it. The Japanese offensive also complicated Chinese logistics, as it made transporting grain from the fertile Sichuan province more difficult. To add to China's troubles, the Japanese had cut them off from Allied help in Burma. In December 1941, the Japanese invaded British-controlled Burma. One of their goals was to cut off the Burma Road, China's only supply route for Lend-Lease aid since Japan had occupied Chinese ports, and to threaten its southwest provinces. The anti-imperialist Chiang didn't trust the British, but offered Chinese troops to help. At first, the British refused as they worried about Chinese influence in Burma. The Japanese, though, bombed Allied airfields and Rangoon and gained the support of Burmese dissidents of the Burmese Independence Army. The British belatedly accepted Chiang's help, and 2 Chinese armies with 40,000 men arrived in Burma. They were the best troops that Chiang had, German-trained and partly motorized with Italian and French-built armor. Japanese troops pushed British-led forces, including Indian and Burmese units, back towards Rangoon, and the Japanese used captured airfields to get the upper hand in the air despite the efforts of the RAF and the American volunteer group better known as the Flying Tigers. Disorganized Allied units retreated towards the Sitang River, pursued by Japanese units pushing their men to the edge of their strength and into the fog of war. Japanese Private Shiro Tokita was in a position on a hill overlooking the critical bridge across the river. The hill was uneven in contour, and we could see little of our fellow soldiers. Second Lieutenant Kiyuchi suspected that our own guns might be shelling us, and held a Japanese flag high, trying to communicate with the battery. A piece of shrapnel hit his head, and he died. It was unfortunate that we'd not carried steel helmets, in order to reduce our load in crossing the difficult terrain. British engineers blew the bridge before most of the Indian 17th Division could cross, and the result was a disaster. Here there was chaos and confusion, hundreds of men throwing down their arms, equipment, and clothing and taking to the water, some bringing their arms with them on improvised rafts. As we crossed, the river was a mass of bobbing heads. We were attacked from the air and sniped at continuously from the east bank. The Japanese took Rangoon March 7th and then pushed north as Allied leaders argued. Chiang's new American Chief of Staff, General Joseph Stilwell, wanted to counterattack. But Chiang knew he couldn't afford to lose his best units, and would only commit to a counterattack if the British and Americans did too. Instead, new British commander William Slim and the Chinese agreed they should withdraw, then strike the Japanese when their logistics were stretched. A plan Stilwell considered crap tactics. Chiang eventually allowed his troops to move south to support a British counterattack. But by this point, Japanese reinforcements had arrived, and they were too strong. They pushed back the British again, and threatened to surround the Chinese 200th Division at Toungoo. Chinese General An Yan-tai knew he had to get out of the trap, but Stilwell insisted he stay put, which would probably lead to the division's destruction. So Tai obeyed Chiang and left just in time. Stilwell was livid. Incompetence, lethargy, and disregard for orders amounting to disobedience on the part of Chinese division and army commanders. Unfortunately, my powers stopped well short of shooting. In March and April, the Japanese advanced into North Burma. They took Lashio on April 29th and cut off the Burma Road, forcing British and some Chinese units west into India and the rest of the Chinese forces east into China. Huge numbers of refugees, most of them Indian, struggled through the jungle to make it to safety, with tens of thousands dying on the way. Stilwell wanted all the Chinese to withdraw to India and himself left the Chinese army for the Indian border, a move Chiang saw as a betrayal. Burma was a disaster for the British, but an even worse catastrophe for the nationalist Chinese. Chiang's best troops suffered heavy losses for nothing, and China's last link to its allies was gone. The air supply route over the Himalayas, known as the Hump, couldn't handle anywhere near the amount of supplies that the road had done. The Burma debacle revealed just how strained inter-allied relations in Asia were. The US, UK, and nationalist China had different objectives in the Asian theater. The Chinese wanted to reopen the Burma Road, but the most influential American figures like General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz focused on the Pacific, with China serving a secondary purpose of tying down Japanese troops. Chiang asked for 3 American divisions, 500 US planes in China, and 5,000 tons of supplies a month, but US support never met his demands. Relations between Chiang and the British were also poor. The British priority was defending India, which made the Chinese and Americans suspicious of British imperialism. Chiang had risen to power as a nationalist revolutionary, so he suspected the British simply hoped for others to fight so they could keep their empire. The UK is engaged in a conspiracy to sacrifice others for its own benefits. Chiang also met with Gandhi and other Indian anti-colonial leaders, which angered Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Another problem centered on General Stilwell. He was Chiang's chief of staff and overall US commander in the theater, which created tensions. Stilwell had no command experience, but still expected to command the Chinese armies. Chiang, of course, had other ideas. Stilwell was important as a link to a crucial ally, but Chiang had no intention of letting him control the army. Stilwell misjudged Chinese capabilities and failed to see nationalist strategy from the perspective of its longer war against Japan and the civil war against the Chinese communists. Stilwell and Chiang detested each other. Stilwell referred to Chiang as Peanut and even called him an ignorant, illiterate, superstitious peasant son of a bitch. Stilwell also entertained the idea of a contingency plan to assassinate Chiang if the need arose. Even amongst the Americans there were issues. The two top Americans in China, Stilwell and General Claire Chennault of the Flying Tigers, later absorbed into the 14th Air Force, didn't have the same strategic vision. Stilwell wanted US ground troops in China, and he wanted direct control over Chinese armies. Chennault felt that American air power should be the main US contribution to the war in China, and with enough of it, China could be the base from which US bombers could strike at Japan. As if that weren't enough, the multiple American intelligence and special forces operations in China engaged in a turf war with each other and with Chiang's security services. As Allied leaders argued, the Chinese population was suffering and the nationalist Chinese state was collapsing. The global war put incredible pressure on an already weak nationalist government, institutions, and state infrastructure. Supplies from Burma had been cut off, 50 million refugees had fled Japanese occupation, and public institutions like schools and hospitals were barely functioning. Inflation was rampant and wiped out the savings of many middle-class Chinese who'd supported the nationalist vision of a modern China. Chiang's government desperately needed to pay for and feed its army, but inflation meant that soldiers' salaries couldn't even cover basic necessities. The nationalists imposed a grain tax on peasants to feed the army, which deprived farmers of food stocks and income. In the face of the crisis, the nationalists turned away from their more moderate policies and towards the use of state terror by the security services to stifle dissent. This alienated many intellectuals who'd supported them before. The suffering of nationalist China also led to the Henan famine in 1942 and 1943. Drought, corruption, incompetence, and a poor transport network meant that millions of peasants starved, even though there was grain available in neighboring provinces. It was so bad that many sold their children to buy food, and there were widespread reports of cannibalism. Government official Zhang Zhonglu witnessed the disaster. During our trip to Henan, starving people were digging up grass roots, taking leaves, and stripping bark from the trees. Going south from Zhengzhou, an unceasing stream of refugees begging for food was so misery-inducing that you couldn't bear to look. About 4 million Chinese died in the Henan famine. Nationalist China was coming apart. Chongqing was losing its grip on power, and society was losing its very humanity. Meanwhile, the communist-controlled areas were experiencing a political revival. In 1942 and 43, the regions under communist control inside China also faced terrible conditions: rampant inflation, poverty, and the danger of famine. But here, Mao's relatively effective progressive tax and land policies avoided the extreme fate of nationalist China, helped by the fact that, unlike the nationalists, the CCP didn't have to pay for a large standing army and didn't play a main role fighting the Japanese at this time. The communists did grow their guerrilla Red Army up to 500,000 troops and militiamen, and set up bases in remote areas behind enemy lines that Mao referred to as, quote, the buttocks of the revolution. But these bases were more about the future resumption of the civil war against the nationalists, and communist forces avoided major combat with the Japanese and the nationalists for now. Our line is to wait for improvements in the situation. In the meantime, we preserve our strength while carrying out guerrilla operations employing every sort of tactic, from fierce skirmishing and non-violent revolutionary duplicity to maneuvers against the enemy. Mao used this breathing space to set up propaganda outlets in nationalist-held cities where communist propaganda successfully gave the impression the communists were winning their guerrilla campaign against the Japanese. Mao also renewed his grip on the party. In February 1942, he launched the rectification movement, a radical program to instill discipline and ideological unity. His main targets were intellectuals who criticized him, like author Ding Ling, and prominent party members who'd been to Moscow, the so-called 28 Bolsheviks like Wang Ming. Mao was clear about his targets. Intellectuals who want to serve the masses must go through a process in which they and the masses come to know each other well. This process may, and certainly will, involve much pain and friction. Communist security chief Kang Sheng oversaw a system of false accusations of spying for the nationalists and widespread torture, and Red Army troops restricted the freedom of movement in Yan'an. Even regular soldiers and civilians had to study Mao's texts. This was to be the dry run for Mao's planned reforging of Chinese society once the Civil War restarted, and a foreshadowing of the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s. According to historian Rana Ritter, the war against Japan was giving birth to Mao's China. Since the nationalists were exhausted, the communists lying low, and Japan had transferred forces to the Pacific, the front lines stagnated in 1943. At a key imperial conference in September, Japan shifted to a more defensive strategy focused on protecting the home islands and oil reserves in Southeast Asia. As for China, this so-called new operational policy would require the following: preservation of the status quo in China while increasing pressure against the enemy to destroy his will to fight. In North China, preparations would be made to meet the contingency of Soviet-American cooperation. But no step would be taken that might bring the Soviet Union into the war. But the status quo in China didn't mean no fighting. The Japanese attacked towards Changsha again in May, and towards Changde later in the year, but they didn't have the men to hold any of the gains they did make. American air power, including newer P-51 fighters, played an important role in helping the nationalists stop these Japanese operations based on intelligence from Chinese informants behind Japanese lines. We were particularly successful hitting Japanese targets in Dongting Lake in 1943, when the opportunities arose. Where the Yangtze River came into the lake, there was a Japanese supply collection point. We used napalm and white phosphorus and bombs. Their forces burned for 3 days. It took a month for the Japanese to resupply. Japanese offensives worried the weakened nationalists, though, who considered leaving their capital Chongqing. Chiang even asked what peace terms the Japanese might offer, but these were too harsh. In Burma, the British launched limited attacks and raids, but failed to open up the Burma Road since Europe and the Pacific took precedence. American troops and local workers began to build the alternative Lido Road, but that would take time. On the diplomatic front, Japan hosted a conference in November for members of the so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Tokyo granted Burma nominal independence and tried to legitimize Wang Jingwei's puppet Chinese state with a treaty. Japan also recognized the Free India movement of Subhash Chandra Bose in November 1943. Japan's intentions were to weaken the Allies and create regimes under its control while appealing to the desire of many Asians to throw off European rule. The Allies, meanwhile, were also strategizing, which would turn out to be a disappointment for nationalist China. Chiang lobbied hard for the Allies to prioritize China. His wife, Song Mei-ling, addressed the US Congress pleading for more aid, and Chiang attended the Cairo Conference in November 1943 alongside Churchill and Roosevelt. The resulting Cairo Declaration expressed Allied intentions to liberate Asia and restore Japanese-controlled territories to the Republic of China. Allied planners also agreed to a major offensive in Burma for 1944 to reopen supply lines to China, with the US training and equipping Chinese forces in India. 1942 and 43 had seen more devastation in China, and although it now had powerful allies, it was isolated and weak. The nationalist state was crumbling even as its army fiercely resisted the Japanese, while communists were conserving their strength for a future reckoning. The Cairo Declaration seemed to offer a ray of hope, but some influential Allied leaders and officials still had doubts about Chiang's China. They felt it was weak, corrupt, undemocratic, and some, including Churchill, dismissed it as a great power. Just days after Cairo, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at the Tehran Conference, where they agreed to prioritize the European theater again. China once again took second place in Allied grand strategy, and Chiang felt betrayed. He predicted that Japan would launch a major offensive since China had been deprived of Allied support, and 1944 would prove him right. In 1944, Japan faces crises on many fronts. More and more American troops are moving into the Pacific, inching closer to Japan, and China continues to resist Japanese invasion, tying down huge numbers of men and equipment. But the war is not over yet. There are tensions between the US and China, and Japan gambles on an all-or-nothing offensive to finally win the Second Sino-Japanese War. By late 1943, the Axis are facing disaster. Germany is retreating in Europe, and Japan is stalemated in China and fighting the US in the Pacific. Most Japanese forces are in China, fighting against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. But more troops are needed in the Pacific for island defense, and Japan's economy is buckling. With time running out, Japanese commander in China, Shunroku Hata, plans fresh offensives for 1944. Meanwhile, China struggles to remain relevant in global Allied plans. Although American bombers operate from Chinese air bases in November, the Allies commit to a Europe-first strategy. US-Asian strategy shifts away from an overland push in China or occupation of Formosa towards island hopping across the Central Pacific and liberating the Philippines. Generally, President Roosevelt wants to help China more, but the Soviet promise to join the war against Japan after Germany's defeat is too valuable to refuse. Officially, major US operations in mainland China are still planned, but in practice, they're all but cancelled. This is a problem for Chiang. It further undermines his nationalist regime, which some Americans see as dictatorial, corrupt, and inept. One critic is Chiang's American Chief of Staff, General Joseph Stilwell, who demands control of all Chinese troops from Chiang, who intensely dislikes the American. Other US officers are concerned about Chiang's attitude towards the Chinese communists. The Chinese communist forces around Yan'an have done little against the Japanese, but US curiosity means Roosevelt approves a diplomatic mission to Mao Zedong for later in 1944. Chiang and Stilwell also disagree on strategy. Stilwell opposes an overland push and wants to recover Burma, captured by Japan in 1942, and reopen supply routes to British India. For this, he demands Chiang's best troops, many of whom are blocking Chinese communists. In northern Burma, Stilwell's US-trained Chinese divisions have fought the Japanese since October 1943, making some progress alongside British, Indian, and US irregular units. However, Chiang hesitates to send reinforcements. On the Axis side, Japanese commanders resist launching a Burmese offensive due to logistical and terrain difficulties. But 15th Army Commander General Renya Mutaguchi claims an offensive could cut Allied communications and support the collaborationist Provisional Free Indian government, perhaps triggering an anti-British revolt. Mutaguchi also has personal glory in mind. I fired the first shot at the Marco Polo Bridge and started the war. I think I'm the one to finish it up. But Japanese planning is poor. There is no food plan. Instead, troops will forage or eat draft animals. They also lack heavy weapons and knowledge of the terrain. Even so, in February 1944, Japanese and collaborationist Indian troops strike in South Burma to draw British troops away from the main thrust through central Burma. On March 6th, 85,000 troops launch Operation U-Go towards the Indian towns of Imphal and Kohima. Shortly after the Burma offensive starts, Japan begins its biggest offensive of the entire war in China. Operation Ishigo aims to destroy nationalist forces in central China, link up with occupied French Indochina, eliminate US air bases, and support Yugo. Chiang dismisses warnings of an offensive as Japanese misinformation, so the Chinese are surprised when 500,000 Japanese troops attack on April 19th. Most Chinese troops withdraw, assuming it's just a local offensive. However, Japan crosses the Yellow River with a large mechanized force on a broad front. The first phase is to eliminate the Chinese salient in Henan and link up the Beijing-Wuhan railway. From north and south, Japanese forces strike for Xuchang and Luoyang. At Xuchang, Japanese tanks breach the city gates as infantry engage in urban fighting. Armored dash groups surround Luoyang but face resistance. Japanese reinforcements arrive and capture Luoyang on May 25th, with over 10,000 Chinese killed. Despite the stand at Luoyang, Chinese resistance is half-hearted. There's little communication with Chiang's headquarters, and troops lack vehicles for movement. Henan province is still reeling from the 1938 Yellow River flood and famine. Nationalist commander Jiang Dingwen even complains that civilians attack his troops. During this campaign, the unexpected phenomenon was that the people of the mountains in western Henan attacked our troops, taking guns, bullets, and explosives, and even high-powered mortars and radio equipment. Actually, this is truly painful for me to say. In the end, the damages we suffered from the attack by the people were more serious than the losses from battles with the enemy. Some, though, say Jiang is just making excuses for his poor performance. After Phase 1, Ishigo attacks south towards Hunan and Jiangxi. These provinces are vital for agriculture and recruitment and contain several US air bases. On June 18, 1944, Changsha, which resisted Japanese attack for 6 years, falls after 3 weeks. To the Allies, Ishigo ends China's potential as a major front. Stilwell, whose forces are besieging the Burmese town of Myitkyina, doubles down on that front. Chiang sends 90,000 troops to support him, but is concerned Chinese communists will exploit Ishigo. Soviet advisor to the communists, Pyotr Vladimirov, suggests his fears are justified. The CCP leadership rejoices at the news of the defeat suffered by Chiang Kai-shek's troops. Mao's calculations are simple. Whenever Chiang Kai-shek suffers a defeat, Yan'an benefits from it. But Ichigo can't make up for Japanese failures elsewhere. In June and July, US troops capture the Mariana Islands, bringing the home islands within bombing range. As US forces prepare more island invasions, Japan's Burma and China offensives stall. In Burma, Operation Yugo fails as ill-equipped Japanese forces attack British and Indian positions well protected by artillery and tanks. After repelling a Japanese attack at Imphal in late June, Britain counterattacks. By early July, the whole Yugo force retreats. Of 15th Army's 100,000 men, 30,000 die in combat and 20,000 from disease and malnutrition. In early August, Chinese units with Allied support capture Myitkyina and decimate the Japanese 18th Division. Meanwhile, from early summer 1944, the US 20th Air Force increases bombings of Japanese targets from Chinese air bases. Supplies for the operations are flown in via the Hump, a Himalayan air corridor. The early 1944 crises have consequences in Tokyo. Hideki Tojo, who is Prime Minister, War Minister, and Chief of the Army General Staff, resigns on July 18th, along with the Chief of the Navy General Staff. Kuniaki Koiso replaces Tojo, but has little support in the cabinet. Koiso tries to improve Army-Navy cooperation and publicly re-pledges Japan to the war. Privately, however, his government considers negotiations with Britain and the United States. Japan wants to retain war gains and negotiate from a position of strength, so they continue Ishigo. The offensive, though, loses momentum. In Phase 1, Japan attacked from multiple directions with armored forces and the element of surprise. By July, though, Chinese reinforcements have better air support, while Japanese tanks need repair after a 1,400-kilometer redeployment. In late summer, Chinese defense stiffens at Hanyang, with outnumbered Chinese defenders repelling continuous Japanese assaults. The Japanese capture the city on August 8th, but they take heavy casualties, with estimates from 19 to 60,000. The need for troops renews American calls for Chiang to appoint Stilwell commander of all Chinese forces and accept Mao Zedong's communist forces into the Chinese army. Chiang refuses, but pressure builds. In July, US observers arrive in the communist capital Yan'an. Compared to Chiang's capital, Chongqing, Yan'an appears to them ordered, less corrupt, and even more democratic. Yan'an was really not a sexy town, but the bodyguards, gendarmes, and the claptrap of Chongqing officialdom are completely lacking. Mao and the other leaders are universally spoken of with respect, but these men are approachable, and subservience toward them is completely lacking. Colonel David Barrett's military analysis is less promising. They were excellent guerrilla fighters, but as far as large-scale operations were concerned, they were never able to stand toe-to-toe and slug it out with a strong Japanese force. Chiang's relationship with the US is at a low point, and he asks for Stilwell's recall to the United States. In addition to personal issues, Chiang claims Stilwell's Burmese operations limited his defense against Ishigo. We have taken Myitkyina, but we have lost almost all of East China, and in this, General Stilwell cannot be absolved of grave responsibility. Roosevelt expresses concern at Chiang's complaints, but refuses to recall Stilwell, who still feels betrayed. FDR proceeds to cut my throat and throw me out. They just can't hurt me. To hell with them. The coming US election puts pressure on Roosevelt, and recalling Stilwell could reflect poorly on his leadership. There's already uncertainty surrounding his ailing health. His advisors know he's unlikely to complete a fourth term, so his choice of vice president is important. Eventually, he selects Harry S. Truman over current Vice President Henry Wallace, who some consider too sympathetic to communism. The decision is controversial, as the anti-communist Truman is a relative unknown and hasn't been deeply involved in running the war. On October 19th, Roosevelt bows to the pressure and recalls Stilwell. Chiang offers Stilwell the Grand Cordon of the Blue Sky and White Sun, China's highest military honor. Stilwell claims a blunt response. Told him to stick it up his ass. Roosevelt predicts recalling Stilwell will reflect poorly on Chiang rather than on him, and it turns out that he's right. He wins the election and sends General Albert Wedemeyer to replace Stilwell. Wedemeyer takes a more diplomatic approach, and although issues remain, US-China relations improve. Allied relations are further boosted by events on the battlefield. By December 1944, Ishigo is spent. When Ishigo formally ends in February 1945, Japan claims a major victory. They control more of China than ever and inflict 600,000 casualties. However, Ishigo doesn't shift the dynamic in their favor or end the Chinese war. They lose around 100,000 troops, and although they capture US air bases, by early 1945, the US 20th Air Force has already been relocated from China to the Marianas. Japan is also losing in the Pacific War. In late March, US Marines capture Iwo Jima in bloody fighting, stepping closer to the Japanese home islands. Meanwhile, US operations in the Philippines cut already stretched Japanese logistical routes. These US successes further downgrade the Chinese theater in Allied planning, and the front settles into inactivity. But the suffering continues. Ishigo destroys major fertile regions, and Chiang's regime relies on the newly created United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency. Even so, Chiang is concerned the mostly American-funded program undermines his legitimacy. Germany's surrender in May also has an impact in Asia. Germany provided little practical support for Japan, but its defeat means the full might of the Allies can now be moved east. The US is already advancing on Japanese soil, seizing Okinawa in June 1945. Meanwhile, Stalin wants to gain territory in Asia before the war against Japan ends, so he honors his 1943 pledge to attack Japan. Even so, it's expected Japan can likely hang on for at least another year as invasion preparations get underway. Only very few people know the war is likely to end much sooner than that. By summer 1945, the Second World War has raged for 6 years, and the Second Sino-Japanese War for 8. Even though Japan faces defeat across the Pacific, it controls more of China than at any other point. But soon, new enemies and weapons will collapse Japan's fragile empire. August 1945 proves momentous for both Japan and China. Although Japan has suffered military disasters, it has significant forces in China. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists claw back some territory, while Chiang's US Chief of Staff Albert Wedemeyer makes ambitious plans for a dash to the coast. Such a Chinese effort, though, proves unnecessary, as the atomic bombings and a Soviet offensive give Chiang an unexpected victory. But first, let's take a step back and establish the events from July and early August 1945. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany unconditionally surrendered to Allied and Soviet forces. In July, the victors met at the Potsdam Conference near Berlin. Near the top of the agenda was the ongoing war against Japan, in which the USSR was still neutral. At Potsdam, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin confirmed his 1943 promise to the Brits and Americans that he would join the war against Japan in exchange for Soviet influence in Manchuria, plus South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. He also revealed the Japanese had approached Moscow with informal peace feelers since 1943. By 1945, it was clear they wanted to use the neutral USSR as a mediator to end the war on better terms. Now remember, testing vague peace ideas with a potential mediator country is not the same as being willing to surrender. All the while, Japan's military was preparing the home islands for defense and blocked any serious peace efforts by politicians. Even Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, who favored peace, did not want it at any price. Meanwhile, at Potsdam, US President Harry Truman received a short telegram from the US on July 16th. Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet completed, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. This message meant that the first atomic weapons test in New Mexico had been a success. On July 24th, Truman casually informed Stalin of, quote, a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, equally casually, suggested good use of the bomb could be made against Japan. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Proclamation, but the USSR didn't sign. They called on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face, quote, prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government was divided on how to respond. Emperor Hirohito was head of state, but the country was actually governed by the so-called Big Six cabinet ministers. 3 ministers wanted to ask the Allies for clarification, while the other 3, all military, wanted to reject the proclamation. In the end, the cabinet simply ignored it, but they could not ignore what happened next. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, a B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. It exploded 600 meters above the city, causing ground temperatures to reach 4,000 degrees centigrade. Nearly everyone within 1 kilometer was killed instantly, and those within a 3.5 kilometer radius were terribly burned. High school student Yamaoka Michiko recalled the moment of the explosion. There was no sound. I felt something strong. It was terribly intense. I felt colors. It wasn't heat. You can't really say it was yellow, and it wasn't blue. I thought I would be the only one to die. I said to myself, "Goodbye, Mom." The bomb destroyed 70,000 of Hiroshima's 76,000 buildings and killed up to 110,000 people. The White House released a statement. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. So in August 1945, the US plays its trump card against Japan. Historians have since argued whether the bombings were primarily intended to cause Japanese surrender or to threaten the Soviet Union. Stalin knew of the US atomic program, but was equally taken by surprise. He's now concerned if Japan surrenders before the USSR can join the war, he'll lose what was promised at Yalta and Potsdam. On August 8th, Japanese officials again approached the Soviet Union to intervene diplomatically, but the Soviets give them a declaration of war instead. Taking into account the refusal of Japan to capitulate, the Allies approached the Soviet government with a proposal to join the war against Japanese aggression. The Soviet government has accepted the proposal of the Allies. From August 9th, the Soviet Union will consider herself in a state of war against Japan. 1.6 million Soviet troops invade Manchuria and Korea on 3 fronts. They plan a simple but massive pincer attack against the Japanese Kwantung Army and the occupation of territory promised to Stalin. The Kwantung Army is elite by Japanese standards, but by 1945 it's been stripped of its best units. By August, it has 780,000 troops, but many are new and badly prepared conscripts. The Japanese mobilized the physically infirm, the overage, civil servants, colonists, and students. As late as August 1945, the higher echelons of the Kwantung Field Army were living in a fool's paradise. In Manchuria, there was still no sense of crisis in spite of the atomic bomb. The highly mechanized Soviet force and their Mongolian allies smash the Japanese defenders and rapidly advance. On August 10th, Soviet forces push into South Sakhalin Island, and on August 15th, land on the North Kurile Islands. These rushed attacks go less smoothly. In the attack on Shumshu, Japanese defenders kill up to 2,400 Soviet troops for just 200 Japanese killed, marking the only battle of the Soviet offensive in which Soviet casualties outnumber Japanese. In China, Japanese resistance deteriorates into isolated pockets, especially following Emperor Hirohito's August 15th surrender announcement. By this time, the US has dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The Soviet Union continues to push into Manchuria and makes plans for invading Hokkaido, although these are cancelled. By August 20th, the fighting is over, and Chiang suddenly finds himself as a victor in the Second World War. Chiang had not invited the Soviet invasion, but agrees to a treaty of friendship and alliance on August 14th, confirming Stalin's Yalta gains, granting control of Port Arthur, and partial control of Manchurian railways. In exchange, Stalin agrees to only recognize Chiang's government and stop cooperation with the Chinese Communist Party. Chiang worries the communists will take advantage of Japanese collapse in Manchuria, and he needs time to mobilize the Kuomintang. He asks the Soviets to stay longer than the agreed 3 months, and the Soviets happily oblige. They strip Manchuria's industrial equipment and intern 600,000 Japanese prisoners for labor, 10% of whom eventually die in Soviet captivity. The Allies help Chiang redeploy his forces by air, and they occupy Beijing and coastal cities. Overall, the end of Japanese operations in China comes as a surprise. The Allies order Japanese troops to defend themselves against Chinese communists and only surrender their arms to Chiang's Kuomintang. The Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1945 kills around 20 million Chinese, including between 3 and 4 million military deaths. Japanese casualties are around 3.5 million, including 700,000 dead, but all these estimates are debated. Perhaps 8 million Chinese civilians are killed due to military action and war crimes, including up to 500,000 as a result of Unit 731, the Japanese Biological Warfare Research Unit. From 1946, the Allies, China, and the Soviet Union try Japanese leaders and war criminals. Charges date back to the Japanese occupation of Manchuria in 1931, and in late 1948, 7 high-ranking figures, including Hideki Tojo, are executed, along with 984 others. The USSR separately tries members of Unit 731 in 1949, and many receive sentences of forced labor in exchange for information. U.S. General Douglas MacArthur gives Unit 731 personnel in U.S. custody immunity in exchange for similar information. Depending on the estimate, the total loss figures put China close to or equal to the Soviet Union. Still, the Chinese contribution and experience in the wider Second World War is often overlooked. China's recent rise as a world power has caused some historians, though, to reconsider its role. Indeed, it is the Marco Polo Bridge incident that immediately initiated a train of events ending with the dissolution of the Asian empires of Britain, the Netherlands, Japan, and France in favor of at least 19 sovereign nations. the division of Korea, the communist takeover of China and continuing conflict over the status of Taiwan, and the American military hegemony over Japan and the East Pacific that persists to this day. Although the Second World War and the Second Sino-Japanese War end in 1945, China is not at peace. Even before Japan officially surrenders on September 2nd, Chiang's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists prepare to resume civil war. Taiwan is a small island at the center of global tensions. It's the world leader in strategically important chip production and the linchpin of the US's island chain strategy to contain China. And it could be the spark that sets off a great power war. But how did it get this way? The story of the Taiwanese powder keg goes all the way back to the 1940s and China's unfinished civil war. The Japanese surrender and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in August 1945 have serious consequences for China, which has been resisting a Japanese invasion since 1937. By 1945, Japan occupies large areas of China, but has been unable to fully conquer the country, despite the loss of 20 million Chinese civilians and troops. Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese wartime commander and leader of the nationalist forces in the Kuomintang Party, or KMT, suddenly finds himself as one of the victorious allies. But the Japanese surrender comes as a surprise and increases tensions with other factions in China. Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, officially fights alongside the KMT against Japan, but in practice, their so-called United Front fell apart back in 1941. From 1927 to 1937, the KMT and CCP fought a bloody civil war in which the KMT forced the communists into the Chinese hinterland. The United Front never healed the rift between the two factions, and tension and distrust continues through to 1945. The CCP did little actual fighting against the Japanese, and instead worked to expand their bases from their capital at Yan'an. Now that the Japanese have surrendered, these new so-called liberated areas could support the communists in a likely resumption of the Civil War. During the war against Japan, the US supported Chiang with arms and training, despite US concerns about corruption and incompetence in the KMT. Some Americans were more impressed by the communist movement based in Yan'an, which successfully presents itself as less corrupt and more representative. However, the US shifted away from the CCP towards the end of the Second World War. In April 1945, the US announced it will only recognize Chiang's nationalists. Unsurprisingly, Mao Zedong complains. "We don't understand why America's policies seem to waver after a good start." As the KMT and CCP race for Japanese-held territory, the US supports Chiang with an airlift into major cities away from KMT base areas, as well as landing 50,000 US Marines in coastal areas to prevent CCP advance. Competition is especially fierce in Manchuria, currently occupied by the Soviet Union, against Chiang's wishes. Manchuria is heavily industrialized and was the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo since 1931. Its large army is well equipped and trained by Chinese standards and could be integrated into either the KMT or the CCP. For the CCP, Manchuria's proximity to other communist regimes is key. Mao compares it to a sturdy armchair, with the Soviet Union as the back and Soviet-dominated states in Mongolia and North Korea as the sides. The Soviet Union, though, provides only limited help to the CCP, allowing them to receive Japanese arms, but stopping short of political support. So in 1945, the KMT seems to have the advantage thanks to US support. The US still sees China as a pillar of its policy in Asia, and it doesn't want a new civil war. So President Harry Truman dispatches high-profile General George Marshall to oversee negotiations between the KMT and CCP. Both sides appear willing to negotiate, but this is largely for show for Marshall's benefit, as neither budges from core demands. The CCP wants control in its liberated areas and to keep its own army until a new government, including the communists, is formed. Chiang demands the CCP give up control of its territory and troops before creating any new government or constitution. 6 weeks of talks result in little more than a tenuous truce and vague joint statement. Civil war must be avoided at all costs, and an independent, free, prosperous, and strong new China be created. Both sides likely prefer war to political agreement. Chiang's reluctance to compromise is boosted in August 1945 when he signs a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union. In exchange for withdrawal from Manchuria and recognition of Chiang's government, the Soviet Union gains the naval base at Port Arthur and economic concessions in Manchuria. Stalin believes the CCP will lose a war against the KMT, but Mao is shocked at the supposed betrayal. On paper, there is a military imbalance. In 1945, the KMT has around 4.3 million troops, including 2 million regulars. Some units are well equipped with US weaponry, including infantry firearms, artillery, aircraft, and tanks. However, KMT troops are spread out across China, causing severe logistics problems. Loyalty and morale vary greatly. Chiang's most loyal commanders get the best equipment, but they're not always the most competent. Many of his best officers were killed fighting the Japanese, and those who remain are often locally recruited non-professionals vulnerable to corruption, bribery, and political infighting. Meanwhile, the CCP has around 900,000 troops supported by militias. Most are guerrilla troops, and to win any civil war, Mao understands they must be transformed into a conventional force. They do acquire captured Japanese and gifted Soviet equipment, including 700 tanks and 900 aircraft, but there's little experience in using such weaponry. CCP commander Zhu De, who's responsible for developing a new People's Liberation Army, wants practical improvements. He initially ignores tanks and aircraft in favor of heavy artillery, improved communications, and tactical training. The CCP also operates under Maoist strategic principles, which prioritize mobility and survival over control of key locations. For defeating Chiang Kai-shek, the general method of fighting is mobile warfare. Therefore, the abandonment of certain places or cities is not only unavoidable, but also necessary. CCP morale, coordination, and strategic focus are all better than the KMT. The party strictly controls all commanders and expects coordinated, concentrated moves against Chiang's spread-out forces. The CCP is also carrying out rural reforms, backed up by vigorous political education, which earns some support from peasants in their base areas. Meanwhile, nationalist regions suffer from economic crises, food shortages, and broken infrastructure, partly due to the Japanese invasion, but also nationalist mismanagement and resistance to reform. Nationalist control is also concentrated in the major cities, allowing the CCP to expand in the countryside from 116 counties across China to 175. As both sides expand, clashes intensify between KMT and CCP troops in early 1946, especially in Manchuria and the cities of Changchun and Xiping. As the CCP expands in the region, the KMT fight to link up their garrisons. Marshall returns and oversees a new ceasefire in Manchuria, but both sides remain distrustful. Chiang knows truces benefit the CCP, but his government's return to the capital of Nanjing also brings more pressing domestic issues. However, he wants to quickly eliminate the CCP and reinforce China's post-war status as an emerging great power before any meaningful political development. It is first necessary to deal harshly with the communists and later, after 2 or 3 months, to adopt a generous attitude. The CCP takes advantage of the ceasefires to spread its influence in Manchuria, including taking control of the largest city of Harbin following Soviet withdrawal. The party is now firmly entrenched in northeast China and develops a policy of offense in the north, defense in the south. Still, most CCP troops remain in their base areas and generally give ground to KMT forces. Washington says its support for Chiang depends on peaceful coexistence with the CCP, but Chiang launches the general offensive in June 1946. KMT troops mostly target the CCP's Central Plains and Central China military districts and attempt to surround CCP formations. The Communists break up into smaller groups and withdraw, with some rearguard units suffering heavy casualties. Some CCP units launch local counterattacks, stalling the advance and eliminating individual KMT units, but they cannot conduct a counteroffensive. By late 1946, the KMT secures several major cities and the railways between them and forces the CCP out of much of Jiangsu and southern Manchuria, capturing 165 towns and 174,000 square kilometers of territory. Even so, Chiang is frustrated that he hasn't destroyed the main CCP armies. The US is also frustrated with Chiang, and although US Marines remain in coastal cities, they withdraw in January 1947. Marshall blames both sides for an unwillingness to make a fair compromise. In February and March 1947, Chiang keeps up the pressure with his Strong Points offensive. His best forces attack Shaanxi and Shandong in a pincer movement to potentially win the war, and there's heavy fighting around the CCP headquarters in Linyi. The KMT seize the city, but shortly afterwards, the CCP ambush and destroy several KMT units, including well-equipped, mechanized formations considered the KMT's finest. However, the ambushes are also costly for the CCP, who overwhelm armored vehicles with massed infantry attacks. Although the heaviest fighting is in Shandong, the CCP capital of Yan'an in Shanxi is the prime target. After a diversionary attack in the west of the province, the KMT 1st and 29th armies head straight for Yan'an. After light resistance, Mao abandons the capital. We should not try to stop them. Chiang thinks when he has seized the Devil's Lair, he will win. In fact, he will lose everything. We will give Chiang Yan'an. He will give us China. Local CCP counterattacks slow KMT advances from Yan'an, but the KMT captures an additional 191,000 square kilometers and 18 million inhabitants. The loss of Yan'an is undoubtedly a severe psychological blow for the Communists, but it's not as decisive as Chiang hopes. CCP strategy doesn't depend on Yan'an, and its loss does not fundamentally damage the CCP war effort. Mao plans for a long war of at least 5 years, so he aims to conserve and expand his forces while carrying out reforms. Meanwhile, Chiang doesn't prepare for a long war. He postpones reforms until after the war, which he expects to be short, and he resists formal mobilization in favor of local requisition. Chiang only announces general mobilization in July 1947, after it becomes clear capturing Yan'an will not end the war. The nationalists' failure to win the war in 1947 reveals the differences in thinking between the CCP and KMT throughout the Civil War. For the KMT, the war is a campaign of final eradication against supposed bandits, while for the CCP, it's part of a long-term revolutionary struggle for Chinese statehood under communist rule. Since the late 1920s, the CCP has fought largely for survival and develops a pragmatic strategy not tied to one territorial base. Many commanders are younger and gained experience through these survival years. In 1938, Mao wrote, "We should have the courage to retreat. In their ignorance of this principle, the advocates of desperate action will contest a city or a piece of ground even when the position is obviously and definitively unfavorable. As a result, they lose not only the city or ground, but fail to preserve their forces." This is an example of a difference in understanding of strategic principles between the KMT and CCP. Chiang got strategic and tactical advice from Western theorists, including Soviet, Germans, and Americans. Most Western strategists consider cities the center of gravity of strategic operations and the hub of commercial, military, and political control. However, in China, most big cities are in the east and south. The rest of China has few cities that could be considered centers of gravity in the Western sense. While the CCP still mostly functions on a guerrilla basis, wider base areas which provide the support for their mobile forces are more important than cities. Also, while Western strategy often sees military initiative in the attack, as it forces your opponent to react to you, the CCP thinks pre-planned withdrawal can gain one the initiative. Attacking troops entering hostile, unfamiliar territory will have some problems with military organization, logistics, and cohesion. Only once this happens, and the CCP has a decisive advantage, do they target specific units to eliminate. Since KMT commanders lack coordination, eliminating a single unit is often enough to stop or even reverse an entire offensive. So for the CCP, retreat, far from being an acceptance of defeat, is in fact a necessary preliminary to victory in the form of ambush and counterattack. And in late 1947, the CCP does just that. The KMT general and strongpoint offensives bring the nationalists control of more of China than arguably any other point, but they still cannot defeat the communists. Chiang's forces are far from their bases and logistical hubs, while many troops are tied down in garrisons. As the strongpoints offensive was designed as a war-winning operation, the KMT doesn't know what to do with the troops now spread across the country. This short-sightedness means inefficient local administration struggles to sustain large garrisons, as historian Christopher Liu explains. Consequently, the large-scale strategic and territorial gains won during both offensives transformed into burdens virtually overnight. The Kuomintang simply lacked the resources to defend them adequately, and the forces they did have were dangerously overstretched. Meanwhile, CCP forces expand to 2 million troops and double their artillery and machine guns. CCP counterattacks start to reverse KMT gains in northeastern China, encouraging Mao to launch counteroffensives from May 1947. In the summer, autumn and winter offensives, CCP troops concentrate against individual cities, hoping to ambush relief columns from neighboring areas. Soon, KMT commanders are reluctant to send any assistance at all, and CCP forces advance across the battlefront, especially in Shandong, Shanxi, and Manchuria. Although Chiang orders cities to fight to the death, mass defections lead to the loss of some well-defended cities in a matter of days. By September, Mao orders his commanders to immediately press gang defectors into their forces. From now on, you must change your habits of relying on supplies from the liberated areas. People, food, weapons, clothes, all must come from the enemy troops and the enemy's rear. Whenever you capture enemy soldiers, just fill them into your own forces. KMT losses are especially severe in Manchuria. The new KMT commander, General Chen Cheng, is a Chiang loyalist with roughly 500,000 US-equipped troops. But by mid-1948, the communists push back his forces into small pockets of territory around Jinzhou, Changchun, and Shenyang, with the loss of 150,000 KMT troops. Chen has little hope of success, but Chiang orders him to stand firm and expect reinforcements via airlift. So the KMT flies in 250,000 more troops from defense duties elsewhere in China. CCP commander in Manchuria, Lin Biao, has previously been reluctant to attack without significant preparation, which angers Mao. The key to the whole military situation in the northeast lies in the capture of Yi County, Jinzhou, and Jinxi. However, it has been 3 weeks since your troops moved out, and you have still not started the attack on Yi. The movement is so unbelievably slow, you should conduct self-criticism. In September 1948, the CCP launches its Liaoning-Shenyang offensive against Jinzhou, Shenyang, and Changchun. Lin's forces besiege Jinzhou on October 14th, pounding its medieval walls with heavy artillery before bloody street fighting begins. 90,000 KMT men surrender. The CCP then rapidly swings towards Shenyang, eliminating an attempted KMT counterattack in marshland near Heishan. This defeat causes the KMT commander in Changchun to defect. The starving city had been under siege since August, and there are reports of cannibalism. KMT defectors in the city now fight their former comrades who refuse to defect. After a brief battle, Changchun surrenders to the CCP on October 26th. All that remains is Shenyang. The nationalist new First Army rushes to its defense, but CCP formations outflank and destroy it in a 9-day battle, with 100,000 losses. After a lackluster defense, Shenyang surrenders on November 2nd. The Liaoshen campaign is a vital communist victory. Communist casualties are unknown, but repeated attacks on walled cities likely make them significant. However, the KMT loses some 400,000 of its best troops through casualties and defections. These defections mean CCP forces actually grow and likely now outnumber the KMT. As the war intensifies and territory changes hands, more and more civilians find themselves under new governance and often under new threats of violence. CCP military operations run parallel to a political campaign based around Mao's agricultural reforms and urban student movements. Later mainland Chinese historiography argues much of the population supported communism, but assessing actual support is difficult. It certainly varied as the war progressed and from region to region. CCP reforms like reducing rents, redistributing land, and creating village committees do earn support, although few peasants outside traditional CCP base areas are ideological communists and local committees are under strong communist control. Despite intense political education campaigns, many peasants cling to traditional aspects of village life, although land redistribution does create new loyalties, if only out of necessity. After the farmer receives his share of the land, he will naturally think that the only way to preserve his share of the land is to follow the CCP to the very end. As a matter of fact, farmers are fearful of measures of revenge from the landlords, and it is highly probable that they will plunge in with the CCP. The party's urgent need for troops and supplies also leads to a radical program often led locally by students and political officers. Coercion, propaganda, and violence are common, especially against landlords and wealthier peasants. CCP officials encourage peasants to partake in sometimes violent public humiliations and denunciations of wealthier peasants, although some use the process to settle older disagreements. Estimates vary, but between 1945 and 1949, communist-led violence may kill up to 1 million landlords. Notable social critic Xu Wancheng claims the CCP used the crisis of war to justify harsh actions. The CCP sets fires and kills people, and in everything its talents are used for destruction. The CCP is happy at disasters and delighted at calamities. Their only fear is that the empire is not in chaos. CCP officials are also often disappointed with the amount of land and property actually available to redistribute to the poorer classes. As a result, they target even mildly better off peasants and seize their property in public trials. But civilians in KMT areas also experience violence and suffering, both deliberate and from economic mismanagement. A massive economic crisis and hyperinflation destroy savings. Between 1945 and 48, prices in KMT areas rise on average 30% per month. The nationalists make the problem worse by the forced conversion of Japanese-issued currency for KMT notes at a terrible exchange rate. Chinese in former Japanese-occupied areas are also vulnerable. The KMT sees many as Japanese collaborators, and returning landlords demand overdue rent under threats of violence. As KMT logistics break down, troops often steal food and winter clothing. This is especially true in Manchuria, which had avoided many of the hardships of earlier wars. The US ambassador notes, "Nationalist southern military forces and civil administrators conduct themselves in Manchuria as conquerors, not as fellow countrymen, and have imposed a carpetbag regime of unbridled exploitation upon areas under their control. If military and civil authorities of local origin were in control, they too would probably exploit the populace, but experience has shown that Chinese authorities of local origin, in general, never quite strangle a goose laying golden eggs." Many of the economic problems in KMT areas stem from the war with Japan. Many civilians tolerated hardship then, but in a civil war they're less willing, especially when one side claims to represent an alternative social and economic model. Exhausted KMT soldiers are just as fed up with suffering as civilians. Nationalist troops who tolerated terrible conditions in the Sino-Japanese conflict are less willing to do so against fellow Chinese. As KMT morale drops, discipline gets harsher, and food shortages get worse, CCP propaganda becomes more effective. Brothers, lay down your arms, which you never wanted to take up. Did you join the Kuomintang army freely? No, you were dragged into it at the end of a rope. Come over to us. If you want, we will send you home. Better still, you can join us and fight to free your home as we have ours. As KMT desertions increase, Mao now predicts victory in 1 year. In September 1948, CCP forces captured Jinan, marking the final transition of the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, into a conventional force. Chiang believes the CCP must be exhausted after a series of bloody battles, but he underestimates their ability to maintain the offensive with captured supplies and troops. In November, the PLA then launches the Huaihai campaign to capture Suzhou, a major city and strategic railway hub. Chiang reinforces the city with 150,000 men, but they're soon trapped when CCP forces capture Suxian, blocking withdrawal to the south. Initially, KMT troops hold their lines around Suzhou, thanks largely to their advantage in armor, artillery, and air support. The CCP invests more troops, including its new armored units, until 1.8 million combatants on both sides flood the area, making the Huaihai campaign arguably the largest post-World War II battle ever. On the KMT side, personal rivalries and fear of ambush hinder the deployment of their forces. This fear is well-founded. While the KMT 7th Army awaits delayed reinforcements east of Suzhou, CCP troops surround the city. The 7th Army tries to fight towards Suzhou, but communist artillery destroys it during a 10-day battle in late November. Chiang orders his men to hold firm, and the KMT commander in Suzhou, Du Yuming, remains loyal. However, seasonal rain and fog mean KMT air and armored support diminish, and relief attempts fail. By December, some of the wounded are evacuated by air, including with support from Civil Air Transport, a civilian airline founded by General Claire Chennault, the former commander of US pilots operating in China in World War II. But those who remain are now eating grass and animal bones. Chiang eventually allows a breakout attempt to the south, and although it takes the CCP by surprise, they stop it in 3 days. Freezing and starving, Du Yuming surrenders on January 10, 1949, along with 100,000 of his men. One officer tells his CCP captors his last meal was his American sheepskin gloves. The Huaihai operation seals the nationalist fate on the mainland, especially since the communists go on the offensive elsewhere at the same time. From November 1948, CCP forces also target KMT positions around the Beijing-Tianjin railway line. The CCP Pingjin offensive aims to push them out and open up the way to Beijing. Once again, CCP forces ambush KMT units moving into new positions. After communist troops ambush a force at Xinbaoan, 2 CCP armies destroy a KMT relief force from Beijing, and the CCP capture Zhangjiakou and Xinbaoan. Meanwhile, CCP artillery pins the KMT in the walled town of Tianjin before PLA infantry storm the city in brutal house-to-house combat. After several costly assaults, the CCP capture Tianjin on January 15, 1949. By January 31st, the CCP is in Beijing. The city's KMT commander informed Mao he no longer recognized Chiang's authority and vacates the city to the CCP. They enter in a military parade observed by an American. Tanks, armored cars, truckloads of soldiers, trucks mounted with machine guns, trucks towing heavy artillery, innumerable ambulances, jeeps, and other smaller vehicles. It was probably the greatest demonstration of Chinese military might in history. But it was primarily a display of American military equipment, virtually all of it captured or obtained from Kuomintang sources. After the series of KMT disasters and Mao's rejection of ceasefire talks, Chiang resigns as president on January 21st. This is a symbolic move since he maintains military command. His only hope now is to hold a defensive line south of the Yangtze River. As troops, refugees, and civilians flee south and into the major cities, Chiang hopes the communists are exhausted after months of heavy fighting. Some CCP commanders do want to rest and recuperate, but Mao orders the offensive to continue. By spring 1949, they cross the river as KMT troops simply refuse to fight or flee south. Chiang orders Nanjing and Shanghai to hold out, but both cities are in chaos. Government offices evacuate, there's widespread looting, and roaming squads execute anyone they think is a communist agent. Many KMT troops evacuate the city to the south. And with Shanghai holding important economic and symbolic value, the CCP hopes to capture it without a serious fight. The Battle of Shanghai can be aptly compared to battling rats in a china shop. You must catch the rats and must not break the precious porcelain. In the end, both cities fall with little fighting in April and May. Through the summer and fall, the CCP continues to advance against light resistance, capturing Changsha in August and Changzhou in October. On October 1st, 1949, Mao proclaims a new Communist People's Republic of China, essentially claiming victory in the Civil War. Chiang considers making a last stand in his old capital of Chongqing, but he finds few allies willing to fight and heads for Chengdu. But the CCP is about to take Chengdu, so on December 7, 1949, the sick and exhausted Chiang flees with the remainder of his government and 2 million troops to the island of Taiwan. Taiwan, formerly known as Formosa, had been a Japanese colony since 1895, and Chiang's arrival in 1945 was seen by some locals as a switch from one colonial regime to another. US bombing in World War II devastated the capital of Taipei, and post-war KMT officials had little inclination to redevelop Taiwan. Locals are seen as Japanese collaborators and are treated harshly by officials. When large-scale demonstrations break out in February 1947, the new authorities kill 10,000, putting them down. As refugees and troops from the mainland arrive in 1949, they quickly work to make Taiwan defensible, but also conduct training for a return to the mainland. Even so, some KMT officials do not expect the regime to last long, and a communist invasion seems likely. The CCP considers invading, but it runs into problems at the Battle of Guningtou. KMT forces repel an invasion on a much smaller island, revealing the CCP's naval and amphibious weakness. The CCP do later capture Hainan in April 1950, but only with the help of a strong local communist movement. Taiwan remains out of reach. And Mao's People's Republic also has issues elsewhere. He claims other regions that are still outside of his control, like Xinjiang and Tibet. Both are ethnically diverse and religiously distinct from most of China, with Xinjiang being mostly Muslim and Tibet Buddhist. The CCP will eventually take control of both in the 1950s, although separatist movements aided by the US remain. In Taiwan, the situation improves for the KMT by mid-1950. Commanders feel relatively secure on the island, and Chiang reclaims the title of President of the Republic of China. He also hopes for US assistance, but is mostly disappointed. President Truman announces, "We are not going to get involved militarily in any way on the island of Formosa." The Chinese Civil War never officially ends, though historians usually point to Chiang's flight to Taiwan on December 7, 1949, following the CCP's capture of Shanghai. Calculating casualties verges on the impossible. Post-war communist Chinese historiography downplays CCP losses, which were often difficult to assess in any case due to a large influx of new recruits and defectors. A reasonable estimate for the period of 1945 to 1949 is around 2 million military casualties from both sides, and 5 million civilian deaths, including from famine. Communist victory and nationalist defeat have several explanations. The KMT's poor strategy plays a role, especially Chiang's keeping significant forces in Manchuria away from their main bases. The KMT also suffered from extremely low morale. Exhaustion from fighting the Japanese, harsh discipline, and starvation conditions in some units contributed to defections. One estimate suggests 40% of KMT recruits deserted during training, while 20% of casualties may have been from malnutrition. In some cases, KMT officers physically tied their troops together to prevent desertion. Many troops simply wanted to go home. When KMT victory seemed imminent in 1946-47, morale held, but as soon as the prospect of a long war emerged, it collapsed. Communist forces, on the other hand, were mostly well-rested, ideologically motivated, and competently commanded. Post-war Chinese historians have highlighted Mao's role, but many of his commanders, like Lin Biao, Zhu De, Zhou Enlai, and Liu Shaoqi, were essential in turning the CCP from a guerrilla movement into a regular army. The CCP was also able to keep its movement and army under strict party control, thanks to the Yan'an rectification movement of 1942 to 1945. CCP officials kill up to 10,000 of Mao's real and imagined opponents and force others into line and establish a cult of personality. These purges do create a cohesive and obedient command structure though, although earlier in the war, Mao did take advice from his commanders. Other historians argue political and social differences were more important than military realities. The CCP's policy of reform may not have created legions of dedicated communists, but they did appeal to practical peasants who suffered physical and economic hardships under KMT rule. Under its founder, Sun Yat-sen, the Kuomintang started as a party of reform and nationalist revolution, but by 1945, war and corruption eroded trust. Chiang himself complained in 1949. To tell the truth, never in China or abroad has there been a revolutionary movement as decrepit and degenerate as we are today, nor one as lacking spirit, lacking discipline, and even more, lacking standards of right and wrong as we are today. Chiang's critics, though, say he blamed the wider KMT to distract from his own failings as commander. As the war went on, the KMT relied more on urban commercial elites for income and support. This hindered meaningful reforms in the countryside. Simple KMT reforms which were carried out, like improving public hygiene, did not address the peasantry's worries about land and rights, forcing many to rely on UN aid. The fragmented, undisciplined KMT administration also meant local officials often governed in their own interest, including taking over profitable businesses and selling relief supplies onto the black market. The US worked to undermine such operations in Shanghai, but they remained rife elsewhere. Such corruption provided political ammunition for the communists, as historian Emmanuel Shu concludes. The stone that one builder had rejected became the cornerstone of the other's house. So CCP military and political organization gave it the advantage over a fragmented and corrupt KMT. But Chiang also miscalculates US intentions. China is no longer a US priority, especially as US-occupied Japan emerges as a more reliable regional partner. By 1947, the US stops most of its assistance to Chiang, a decision that mostly earned bipartisan support. Chiang and his wife then focused their diplomatic efforts on the Republican Party, which they expect to win the 1948 election. Instead, the Democratic Truman wins decisively, and the Chinese Civil War is low among US voter concerns. Still, soon after CCP victory, Truman critics accuse him of, quote, losing China. Historians have since pointed out that China was never really Truman's to lose, and suggest that this accusation is just a result of Cold War tensions. US officials later saw China and the Soviet Union as a single, monolithic communist threat, although in reality, the Soviet Union was not overly enthusiastic with CCP victory in China. The CCP's agrarian Maoism clashes with the Soviets' proletarian-oriented Marxism-Leninism, and the Soviet Union fears a strong China may undermine their leadership of global communism. Throughout the war, the Soviet Union sought to keep China weak, and even after relations improved from 1954, tensions remain. US Cold War concern with monolithic communism has major consequences, and by 1950, some of Truman's advisors want him to support Chiang's Republic of China on Taiwan. Truman remains skeptical though, but he does worry about a combined Sino-Soviet attack. For Washington, the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950 seems to signal this very threat. One of the first US actions is to send the 7th Fleet not to Korea, but to the Taiwanese Straits to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. It's a move that probably saves Chiang's republic, which will later become a democracy, and prevents final communist victory in China. For the CCP, what they call the Revolution of 1949 ends the long Chinese upheaval since the collapse of the Qing dynasty back in 1911. But in their eyes, it remains incomplete 75 years later. Since you watched this long and detailed documentary about the wars for China, you might be hungry for even more detailed history documentaries. Crucial for the outcome of the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Chinese Civil War was the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in Europe after the Battle of Berlin in 1945. If you want to learn more about the Battle of Berlin, you should check out our 4.5-hour, 18-part documentary series, 16 Days in Berlin, covering the entire battle day by day with detailed maps, animations, expert interviews, and more. 16 Days in Berlin is the most detailed documentary about this battle ever produced. With our uncompromising portrayal using authentic combat footage, we couldn't upload it to YouTube because of their advertising guidelines. So where can you watch 16 Days in Berlin? on Nebula, a streaming service we're building together with other creators where we don't have to worry about advertising guidelines or the almighty algorithm. Nebula is available in 4K resolution in your browser, on your smartphone, smart TV, or streaming box like Apple TV or Roku. And that's not all. On Nebula, you can also watch all our regular videos ad-free and earlier than on YouTube. Nebula is also a great gift, by the way. Just go to gift.nebula.tv/realtimehistory to gift an entire year to family and friends, even if they already have an account. If you go to nebula.tv/realtimehistory, you can watch 16 Days in Berlin, our other original documentaries, Rhineland 45 and Red Atoms, as well as a host of other smart creators. And all that for just $36 for an entire year. Whether you watch Nebula on your own or give it to someone else, you're supporting us here at Real Time History directly. For a selection of sources used for this documentary, check the video description below. If you're watching this on Nebula or Patreon, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that wouldn't accept a medal from Joseph Stilwell.